All right. Well, I appreciate the invitation, Carla, to spend some time this evening with you and your Master Gardener interns there in Montgomery County. Our topic this evening is turfgrass management in Tennessee. We're going to, it's kind of broken into two halves, I guess, the presentation this evening. You know, the first half will be selecting and planting or establishing turfgrass in your home lawn. And then the second half, we'll talk about some ways to go about maintaining, the steps in maintaining, et cetera, things like that. The one thing that I would suggest to you is that if you go to sleep tonight during this, you know, try not to fall out of a chair and hurt yourself. So make sure you're comfortable, and you've got sideboards on the chair, whatever. So if you do fall asleep, you won't fall out. Typically, my experience is that people, you know, fall into one or two categories. Usually, when we start talking about turf grasses and home yards, you know, either it's a popular topic for them, or they just don't care much about it. And you know, either way is good. From my point of view, either way is good. But we're going to spend some time talking about the topic of turfgrass management in home lawns here in the state of Tennessee. Now, one thing I would suggest to you before we do anything else is read your book. You know, you've got a good chapter. That chapter 10, written by Dr. Tom Samples primarily, is an excellent turfgrass reference. And if you become familiar with the majority of the information in there, well, you don't need me, because you will have a whole head full of knowledge and information about turfgrass management. But we're going to proceed. Okay, we're going to go further. So the first thing we'll discuss this evening is selecting a turfgrass to try to establish and maintain in a home yard. Now, as you finish up your Master Gardener training, your education, and you go through the process and become a certified Master Gardener, you know, people in the community are going to learn that about you, and the folks that are in your sphere of travels, in your circles, then at the store, at your place of work, where you worship, the folks that you meet on a regular basis down at the gym, whatever the case may be, they're going to know you're a Master Gardener, and because of that, you are wide open. You're a prime candidate to get questions. And a very common question that folks will ask you is, which turfgrass species is the best one for me to grow? What's the best grass I can grow? Well, I will tell you that the correct answer every time to that question is it depends. It depends on what your expectations are, the person that's talking about wanting to grow this grass. It depends on your site. It depends on where you're located. A lot of different things. Now, you can see listed here several different turfgrass species. You see Bermuda grass, centipede grass, Kentucky bluegrass, zoysia grass, etc. Any of those or none of those could be the right choice, the best choice for a given location. So the first thing, or one of the first things we've got to do, is learn about some of the characteristics and what the requirements, what the growth habits are, and so on. But maybe one of the most important pieces of information that you can give to someone asking you about what's the best turfgrass for me to grow in my yard here in Tennessee is to tell them, don't waste your time unless you have at least 6 inches of soil in the yard. If you don't have 6 inches of soil depth, and if you don't have a good 4 hours of sunlight, and that can be filtered sunlight, etc. But if you don't have enough light and you don't have enough soil, then you're not going to be able to consistently maintain a stand of turf grass throughout the year. You know, you can certainly get it established and grow it there for part of the year, and then you lose it, and you just keep going through the process. And that's okay. If that's what an individual chooses to do, it certainly helps the economy. It helps out the garden centers and keeps a lot of folks employed, I guess, selling grass seed and fertilizer and whatnot. But, in the whole scheme of things, a person can become very frustrated trying to grow plants, not just grasses, but any plants on places that aren't suited to support that plant growth. So that's the first thing. Make sure that you've got a site that will support turf grass growth. And that's going to mean, 6 inches of soil depth as a minimum. Okay. And then you got enough sunlight to grow grass, and you're going to need 4 hours of light throughout the course of the day to do that. In those shady places where you don't have enough sunlight, that's where you have grass that gets real thin. You grow things like wild violets and so on. Okay. So let's start talking about some of the characteristics of these different grasses that are out there that you could possibly make a choice about. We can categorize grasses different ways. They can be categorized by how they grow. Well, so there's one of two ways basically these grasses grow. They either grow as a bunch grass or a sod forming or creeping grass. Bunch grasses are those you see listed there: annual ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, the fine fescue, chewings, hard and sheep fescue. Okay, those are clump forming grasses, bunch grasses. They don't spread, they don't creep. There's a little asterisk down there. Some tall fescue varieties may have short rhizome. They're very short rhizomes, and a rhizome we'll talk about in just a minute, but is one of those creeping, spreading structures that some grasses have, but they don't creep enough to count. Okay, so tall fescue is a bunch type grass. Then the other option is a sod forming grass. So those grasses creep, and they're called sod forming because they creep and they spread and they knit together and create typically a denser canopy and a more dense sod, a more dense turf. That's why they're referred to as sod forming. So some of those spread via rhizomes, so they're called rhizomatous grasses, and we'll see what those are in just a minute. But a rhizomatous grass examples include Kentucky bluegrass and strong creeping red fescue. Then you have those grasses that creep by stolons or spread by stolons. Well, stoloniferous grasses that spread by stolons include centipede grass and St. Augustine grass. And then there are those grasses that spread by both rhizomes and stolons. Bermuda grass and zoysia grass are both rhizomatous and stoloniferous grasses, so they spread above ground and below ground. When we're talking about bunch type grasses, okay, they form a clump. The seed germinates and the little shoot comes up, the leaf comes up, and at some point they start to put on side shoots, and that's what this little picture right here illustrates. Those side shoots are called tillers, and you can see those illustrated here. Multiple stems coming off the same plant down there. You can see the crown illustrated, and those side shoots are called the tillers. Here's an example. If we read from right to left, you'll see grass plant that has one tiller. It's a small side shoot coming up. Then you've got a 2-tiller grass plant, a 4-tiller grass plant, a 7-tiller grass plant, etc. But that's how those bunch grasses, that's how they spread with their limited spread, and they don't spread a lot, but their limited spread is via the enlargement of those clumps of those bunches by the formation of side tillers. Here you see a fine example of a bunch type growth on tall fescue. Tall fescue is a bunch grass. Those are individual tall fescue plants, and they are planted with lots and lots of space and distance in between them, and that allows them to show their bunch forming growth habit. Now, that's not a very good characteristic or a good feature to see in a home lawn. You don't want those big clumps of grass, but you're going to grow those grasses at such a high population density that you're not going to have individual plants that have enough room to grow and form those clumps. You're going to keep them crowded together because you're going to plant lots and lots of seeds, per 1,000 square foot area. You're going to have lots of plants out there, so they don't exhibit that kind of habit. But those clumps only grow so far, and they don't get any bigger than that. So they kind of stay where you put them. They're not creeping grasses. That's what bunch grasses are. Then we've got here a clump of zoysia grass. The zoysia grass is, like we mentioned already, is a sod-forming grass. It spreads by stolons above ground and rhizomes below ground. Now, you can't really see what those are in this picture, so let's look here. On the top, we see a Bermuda grass stolon. The stolon is a stem. It's a stem. That's what it is. That runs horizontally over the surface of the ground. And if you can see my pointer, my mouse up here on the screen as I move it around, at nodes, okay, it puts up shoots, and it can also put down roots. So you can see roots coming here. These are off the nodes, and these are the stolons. All right, and you'll hear about sprigging. Well, sprigs are pieces of stolon that have been harvested. All right, that's what a grass sprig is. It's sometimes used to establish some of these sod-forming grasses. Well, underground, on Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, both, you also have rhizomes. You also have rhizomes on Kentucky bluegrass and strong creeping red fescue. But a rhizome is very similar to a stolon, except it runs below the ground horizontally, and it has nodes, and those nodes put up new shoots, new plants, and they also make new roots. So they spread above ground and below ground. So you got stolon on top, a rhizome here on the bottom. So that's how creeping grasses are going to spread, the sod-forming grasses. They will creep out and expand their area. Centipede grass is also a creeping grass. We saw that one listed in the picture. There's a shot of a centipede grass stolen running out there across that bare ground. Now, so we can categorize grasses by how they grow, either bunch type or creeping grasses or sod forming grasses. We can also categorize them by when they grow, or under what conditions do they grow. Now, where we live is an area called a transition zone from I guess a climate standpoint or geographical standpoint. We're in what's called the transition zone. To the north of us, it's a cool, humid region. To the south of us, it's more of a warm, humid region. And we're not one or the other. We're kind of in between and in betwixt those two different regions. So we're the transition zone. Now, unfortunately, there is not a grass that is just extra well adapted to growing in the transition zone. So what that means is that we can grow different grasses, several different grasses here in the transition zone, but we just can't grow any of them probably as good as they could be grown maybe in other regions of the United States or other regions of the world. But we work with what we got. Okay, that's all we can do. So from a when grasses grow standpoint, you know, we've got two primary seasons. We have cool season growing grasses and warm season growing grasses. So those that are categorized as cool season grasses, and those are the ones that do their most aggressive above ground growth in the 60 to 75 degree temperature range. And their root growth will take place down to temperatures near freezing, 30, 31, 32 degrees, down in that range. You'll still have a lot of root growth taking place. Now, I said they do their best growth 60 to 75 degrees. That doesn't mean they stop growing at 80 degrees or 85 degrees, but at some point it'll get hot enough that they're going to slow down, way down. And if there's enough water stress on them coupled with heat stress, then they're going to show that stress, and they're going to go into a semi-dormant state to try to protect themselves and survive that heat and dry stress. So examples of cool season grasses: tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, or all the fescues, tall and fine fescue, all the ryegrasses. They're all cool season. Conversely, you got the warm season grasses. Those don't even start growing until it gets good and warm. That's Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, centipede grass, and St. Augustine grass. Those are kind of highlighted in yellow. Centipede grass for years was not used a whole lot in Tennessee, but with some developments over the last, I don't know, 15, 18 years, there has been some centipede grass developed that is probably maybe better adapted and has a good chance of surviving and performing for us in Tennessee. The St. Augustine grass, for the most part, it doesn't survive in Tennessee. That's not a good option for us. Winters are too harsh for it. It won't survive our cold weather. So really and truly, from a Tennessee standpoint, Bermuda grass and zoysia grass are going to be the primary and most often used warm season grasses. You will see some centipede grass that's being grown in places. But when does it like to grow? When it's hot, 80 to 95 degrees. That's when it's going to be taking off and growing great guns. It's not going to grow until the soil warms up enough in the spring of the year for it to start growing and putting out new shoots, new runners below ground, above ground. It will grow at temperatures, way up in triple digits, assuming it gets enough moisture to do that. But it's kind of sweet spot is the 80 to 95 degree temperature range. That's when it really grows, really likes it. From a root standpoint, it'll continue to grow, 50s, maybe the high 40s, above ground growth. When it starts dropping down into the 60s and consistently staying there, that grass really slows down. The warm season grass does. Okay. If we chart the growth curves on cool season grasses, and that's what you're seeing right here, the blue line is root growth and the tan line is shoot growth, then you'll see that we've got two peaks. We've got a springtime peak and a kind of a summer dead slump. Well, this cool season grass, and it gets hot and dry in the summertime, so those cool season grasses suffer. And then you have another peak in the fall of the year. Once we get past the heat of the summer and the nights and so on start cooling off, days start cooling off, those weather conditions or the temperatures favor those cool season grasses to grow again, so they take off and start growing again. So if we look at the growing season on cool season grass, if we had to guess which one of these will give us the most months of green color from a single species, well, cool season grasses are probably going to be greener more months, more days of the year than will the warm season grasses. Because if you look at a warm season, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. A thing to keep in mind, though, we're talking about characteristics, is that when it does get in that hot summertime, this little slump we looked at back here in the previous slide right here. And, maybe it starts in June, depending on how the summer progresses, but July and August, September, for sure, you're going to see way reduced growth. And you may see, if it's dry enough, hot enough, long enough, that this grass starts to show stress. It starts to lose some of that green color. It's not growing so much. And that's typical under hot, dry conditions on cool season grass. That's something to keep in mind. Okay. And just understand that there are going to be times in the year that cool season grass is going to suffer in our summertime weather conditions. So conversely, our warm season grass, if we look at the growth curve on it, the black line is shoot growth, the blue line is root growth. The roots will tend to grow at a little cooler temperatures than do the above ground vertical shoots. This grass is dormant in the wintertime. When it frosts, it turns brown, it doesn't die, it goes dormant. Okay, so it's asleep, it's resting. It does not even think about breaking dormancy until those soil temperatures consistently get up in the 60-degree plus range in the spring of the year, and it starts to wake up and break dormancy. Usually Middle Tennessee, and you guys a little further north than we are down here, it's probably going to be the middle to latter part of April. Typically, it may be even into May, depending on how the season progresses, before you start seeing a lot of growth out of the warm season grass. And then as we transition through the summer, we get over to the latter part of the summertime, in late August and September, the days start to get shorter. Grass really starts slowing down because those warm season grasses will use more sunlight. They need more hours of light, okay, more units of light to actively grow to grow most vigorously. So those days start getting shorter. They start slowing down. Temperature starts to drop off some, so their growth rate slows down. Typically, you've got a shorter mowing season, a shorter growing season with warm season grasses than you have with cool season grasses. Now, this pattern that you see out there is a frost pattern. And this, for folks that aren't familiar with it, and they see Bermuda grass the first time that has this mosaic look to it, well, very often they'll think something's wrong. Well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a pattern caused by frost. And it can occur in the fall of the year as before the grasses have gone totally dormant. Usually you see this after the first fairly decent frost, maybe not a super hard killing frost, but a pretty good frost. And you'll see that grass, going dormant unevenly, and you'll get this mosaic kind of pattern to it. I think it looks kind of cool. You can also see it in the spring of the year if it starts greening up. If we have a warm spell and stays consistently warm for a while, and the grass breaks dormancy and begins to grow, and then we have a late frost, and you may see a springtime frost pattern show up on that grass as well. But the point is, folks need to understand how these grasses respond, some of the characteristics, what they can look like, because if those characteristics are unsuitable to them, they shouldn't choose those grasses. Okay. Now, eventually that Bermuda grass or zoysia or whatever it is, warm season grass, is going to turn brown. And I've had folks tell me, well, I don't like grass that's brown. I want green color. I can appreciate that. But I want to point out that one of the I guess quality traits or quality standards that is often evaluated for a lawn is uniformity of color. Well, brown is a color, and if everything is uniformly brown, then that's pretty darn uniform. So don't rule it out. Okay, don't rule it out. Some places, Bermuda grass or other warm season grass might be the best option for you. That's my point, I guess. And finally, though, I'll point this out. Those creeping grasses, they creep, they spread. So that can be a positive thing, because if there's damage, let's say you're mowing your Bermuda grass lawn in the summer and you run out of gas, and so you bring the gas can of the lawnmower and you're pouring gas in, you spill some on the grass. Well, boom, that gasoline is going to kill a spot there where you spilled it on the grass. Well, if you got a bunch grass, that bunch grass doesn't creep in and repair that area and fill it in. A creeping grass will do that. So that can be, viewed as a good quality, as advantageous. It can also be viewed as a poor quality, because you can see these Bermuda grass stolons running up over this curbing, going to get into a flower bed. But as long as an individual realizes that those creeping grasses spread, and that they do run and creep like that, and that they're going to have to keep them edged out of flower beds and other landscape areas where they don't want that grass in there. As long as they understand that and recognize what they have to do in order to maintain whatever the appearance is they're going for, then that's okay. But just know what you're getting into before you make a long-term choice. Okay. So those are the characteristics. You've got bunch grasses, you've got sod forming and creeping grasses. We've got cool season grasses, we've got warm season grasses. So those are the criteria you got to take in mind or keep in mind when you're evaluating a site as to what kind of grass realistically could grow here. Okay, do I have enough? Most of the warm season grasses do better in full sun. There's some cool season grasses that tolerate shade better, etc. That kind of thing. One tool that's available to anybody that in regards to evaluating, potential varieties of some of these different turfgrass species to utilize is pictured right here. This is called the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, or NTEP, NTEP. NTEP.org is the website. Anybody can access that. And there are NTEP trials grown across this national 2012 national NTEP for tall fescue was trialed in 19 states, 116 entries at each location. The seed companies, they will enter their grasses in these NTEP trials, and the folks that are growing the grasses at these trials, they grow the grasses and they evaluate them based on some of these different qualities that you'll see listed there: quality, color, leaf texture, density, seedling vigor, drought tolerance, etc., those kinds of things. And after so many years, the trial is not just for a single year, it's for multiple years, then they will, finalize the trial and they will tabulate that data and they'll release that. And they'll publish that on the ntep.org website. So if you're shopping for turfgrass at a garden center and boy, this really sounds too good to be true, or there's one there you've never heard of before or whatever, then you can look it up and learn something about it. It might be a very good grass choice for you, but the NTEP can be a tool to help you in the evaluation process when it comes to selecting a grass. So let's talk now about some of those particular grasses, both in the cool season and warm season side. We'll start with tall fescue, and specifically turf type tall fescue, because in the cool season grass world, tall fescue is the most frequently used cool season grass in Tennessee. It's a coarse to medium coarse textured bunch grass, and texture is a measure of blade width. So it's not super fine bladed, but it can be medium to kind of wide bladed depending on the variety, etc. It does have some shade tolerance to open shade. It'll grow in some light shade, not super dense heavy shade. From a wear resistance standpoint, it's pretty good. And there are lots and lots of different cultivars available with tall fescue. Cultivar is just that's two words put together: cultivated variety. Okay, so it's put together to call cultivar. It's all the same species, but they're different varieties of the same species, and so there is, some differences in them that they have been bred, for different characteristics and whatnot. So they are the same species, but genetically they are a little bit different, and some may have, for example, better shade tolerance than others. Some may proclaim to have better disease resistance than others. Some may have darker color than others, etc. But it's all the same species. They're all a bunch type cool season grass. Now, turf type tall fescue. Why is it called turf type tall fescue? Well, here's an example. You can see two turf grass plots here. Well, there's more than two there in the picture. This is my office. We've got a turf grass demonstration site here at the office in Murfreesboro, and we've got both warm season, cool season grasses. Well, here, okay, this lighter green one is the old Kentucky 31 tall fescue. This is not a turf type tall fescue. It's the original unimproved tall fescue. This one over here, you got the darker green color, is a turf type tall fescue. So that is very often that is the most visible difference between turf type and old unimproved tall fescue, is the darker green color. Turf types typically have potential to be darker green color. Usually they're going to be finer textured. May have some better disease resistance or recovery from disease, maybe better ability to withstand drought, and so on. But turf types typically provide a higher quality turf than does Kentucky 31. But there is still a lot of Kentucky 31 tall fescue planted in home lawns in Tennessee. It typically is a cheaper option for large, more utility kind of areas than it is, for fine turf areas. Folks talk about, well, I've got 5 acres or so out there. Okay. Maybe you don't want 5 acres of just really top of the line tall fescue. Maybe you put the turf type tall fescue in what is called your, the yard, the immediate area around your home, and then you can use, a cheaper something like Kentucky 31, maybe in the back 40 back there, the back 5, whatever the case may be. They all grow at the same time. They're all cool season bunch type grasses, but the turf types typically provide a higher quality appearance than does the old unimproved type. So let's shift gears, talk about Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is a cool season grass. Now it's a sod forming grass. Okay, so it spreads. It's not a bunch grass like tall fescue is. It spreads by rhizomes below the ground. It's a medium to medium fine textured rhizomatous grass, spreads by rhizomes, very uniform in color and texture. And if you look at that picture, that stand of Kentucky bluegrass, notice how even all those grass blades are. They're all about the same width. Tall fescue, you may see some variations in blade width in a stand, all the same variety out there. But in Kentucky bluegrass, very uniform, both in color and in texture. It has a much higher water use rate though, and is not as tolerant of drought and heat, nor shade and shade as tall fescue is. So it's more limited in the places that you might consider trying to grow it on a given site, depending on what the shade is, etc. And in all honesty, if you're going to try to use Kentucky bluegrass, you need to have irrigation available. It just is a higher water user than tall fescue is. Probably the highest of the cool season grasses in terms of its water requirements. It just doesn't do so good when we've got lots of hot weather and we get into a drought or a dry spell. It starts to show stress pretty rapidly. And shade tolerance, it's just not very shade tolerant at all. But if you're on a site where you've got you've got access to good irrigation, you've got not much shade on it, good full sunlight, and you like the looks of Kentucky bluegrass, that might be something to consider. It is not used a whole lot as a standalone grass in the home lawns in Tennessee. It is used some, but you don't see all that many just pure Kentucky bluegrass lawns. Then we shift over to the fine fescues, and there are different species of the fine fescues. And they're called fine fescues because they have a very fine leaf texture, very narrow blades. And like I said, there are multiple species. So you can see chewing fescue, hard fescue, sheep fescue, slender creepy red fescue, strong creepy red fescue. They're all fine fescues. Okay, they're all cool season grass. They all have a fine texture, and with the exception of the creeping fescues, creepy reds, they're all bunch grasses. They are the most shade tolerant of the grass options that we have, but they are and they're relatively relatively drought tolerant compared to some, but they're just not real heat tolerant. And so West Tennessee, you don't see much fine fescue being used over there, even in shady places, because the heat tolerance is not there. Probably do better at higher elevations than do down here where we are or I am anyway, down in the bottom of the Central Basin in the state of Tennessee. But they are the most shade tolerant of the grasses available. And if you've got some heavy shaded areas and you're going to grow a cool season grass, then you're probably going to have to include a fine fescue or mixing some of these different species of fine fescues together to create a turf in those more heavily shaded areas. Then we have ryegrasses. In the ryegrass world, there's been annual and perennial ryegrass for years and years. And then somebody said, well, let's cross them up and see what happens. So they crossed the annual and perennial and came up with an intermediate grass or intermediate ryegrass. Well, I've never seen intermediate ryegrass used in a lawn setting. I think it may be used some on some athletic fields under certain conditions, but it's just not been used in home lawns for whatever reason. From perennial ryegrass, it's called a perennial grass, and under the right conditions it is. But here in our area, in our transition zone, it is not a good perennial grass for us. It just does not persist under our hot, dry summer conditions. Now, it can make a very attractive grass, and it'll certainly grow well in cool weather, but it does not survive throughout the summer. Or there may be clumps survive in a planting of perennial ryegrass, and those clumps, for whatever reason, patches of it may survive, but as a dense population, it's not going to happen as a general rule. So we don't use it as a standalone grass. You may see it used in some mixtures sometimes, especially used in mixtures because it germinates very easily. Okay, and people will sometimes, or companies will sometimes, put some perennial ryegrass in a cool season grass mix because when the homeowner or whoever's planting the grass, they put it out there, and maybe they water a little bit and they see that perennial rye, or they see some green starting to pop out. Well, so that encourages them, and maybe they'll continue to water and take care of it, and grow it on in. Well, very often what they're seeing pop out there first is that perennial ryegrass. And so that's one of the primary reasons that I can think of that it is put into some of these cool season seed mixtures. But probably the biggest use of perennial ryegrass here in the southeastern part of the United States is it's used as a high quality overseed on dormant Bermuda grass. If people grow Bermuda grass, they got full sun locations, and it survives heat really well, but they don't want brown grass in the wintertime. Well, they will overseed the ryegrass or the Bermuda grass with the ryegrass before it goes dormant, in the late summertime, so that once the ryegrass germinates, then the Bermuda grass goes dormant. You don't ever see that brown color because the ryegrass already germinated, and now you've got green color all winter long. That is a way to have pretty much year-round green color with using a warm season grass like Bermuda grass. And you'll see it used on athletic fields, football fields in the southeast. Those games they play in late November on these Bermuda grass fields. Well, typically the grass is green out there, and that's because they're playing on perennial ryegrass. It was overseeded in August or September. You'll see it sometimes on golf courses, on fairways that use, say, zoysia grass or Bermuda grass fairway. They may overseed those with some ryegrass to have green color in the fairway for some winter play and so on. But that's probably the best option for us here in Middle Tennessee or in Tennessee period, is to use perennial ryegrass as a high quality overseed on warm season turf. Then the annual ryegrass, it's a lot different than perennial ryegrass. You can see just in the picture here, it's very wide bladed, coarse textured. Whoop, back up. It's got shiny blades on it, shiny color. It's kind of slick looking. It's a winter annual. That's what it is. It's a temporary grass only. The only time you're gonna sow annual ryegrass is if you want something growing on a piece of ground until you can figure out what you're going to do with it, or until you can get something more permanently established there. But it germinates very quickly. But it is a true annual, and it is going to, if you plant it this fall, man, you can have the prettiest, most dense stand of annual ryegrass out there in your yard. But come springtime, as the days start to get longer, start to get a little warmer, that stuff's going to start getting real leggy, a lot more stem to it, less leaf tissue. It's going to start going off color, and it is going to die. It is not going to persist. It is a temporary grass only. So it's used just as a temporary, some quick cover. So we shift over into the warm season grasses now. Here's an example of Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is an extremely aggressive. When I say aggressive, I'm talking about from the standpoint of how rapidly and aggressively it spreads. So it's a very aggressive, creeping, running turf grass, and it's durable. It holds up to wear. Compared to other grasses, it holds up very well. It can range anywhere from medium, coarse, medium texture, not super coarse, but it's not super fine either, all the way to fine texture. It has excellent heat tolerance, but it has poor shade tolerance. Bermuda grass is not going to grow in the shade. It is not going to do it. So if you want to kill Bermuda grass, plant a lot of trees. Bermuda grass is not going to grow in the shade at all. And it has pretty good cold tolerance. It does occasionally get cold enough in Tennessee to cause some cold weather damage on Bermuda grass, but most years it does not. Okay, and there's lots of Bermuda grass used in Tennessee. Again, very heat tolerant. It has good drought tolerance. It can get dry enough, long enough for Bermuda grass to go dormant, to turn brown. I've seen it happen, in the last since 2007, probably 3 times during the summer. And then when the rain returns, those same patches that were brown, they green back up and start growing again. I've never seen it killed. Personally, I've never seen it killed by drought. Not to say that it can't be, but it's just a very rare occurrence for it to happen to us. There are seeded type varieties, and there are hybrid varieties that typically don't produce enough seed in order to be economically feasible to harvest the seed. So that means that some of these Bermuda grasses have to be established vegetatively, through sod or through plugs or through sprigs. These are examples listed right here of Bermuda grass varieties that have to be established vegetatively. Okay, so either through sod, sprigs, or whatever. And there's some good ones out there. There's some good ones. Latitude 36, it's got an RG designation. That RG stands for real good. That's a real good Bermuda grass. Or North Bridge, it's got a real good designation on it too. But Tiffway, Tiffway right there between Tifton 10 and Latitude 36. Man, that grass, it was thought to be the measuring stick for Bermuda grass for years and years, until some of these like Latitude Northbridge came out. And it's still a good grass, still lots of it used out there. But the point is, there are a lot of different varieties, and some of those have to be established vegetatively. You have to buy sod or plugs. You're not going to buy seed for them. And here's an example of Latitude 36. It's a vegetatively propagated Bermuda grass. It's growing right beside some Tiffway. Typically, the runners on Latitude, the stolons on Latitude 36, are a little shorter than they're on Tiffway 419. You kind of see some differences in appearance right there on those. But there are some good seeded types. These are seeded varieties of Bermuda grass, and the seeded types are very often referred to as common types, because common Bermuda grass, I know I was speaking with a lady before we started. She's killed her yard because it had Bermuda grass in it, and now she's reestablished it in tall fescue. Chances are really good that when you have Bermuda grass in your yard, you didn't plant it there. And the neighbors around you haven't planted Bermuda grass, and you've got Bermuda grass. Chances are really good it's common Bermuda grass. That's just kind of wild that folks have it growing all over the place. You don't plant it; it's just there. But so that seeded type or Arizona type has some development's been done for it to breed some higher quality common type, and it's called common type because it does produce enough seed, as common does, for that seed to be harvested and then to be economically feasible to sell that, so that folks can buy this common type, improved common type Bermuda grass seed and establish it that way. Seed is always going to be cheaper than sod. And so that's why it's nice to have some good seeded varieties there. So you can see examples here of some seeded varieties, and there's lots of them. These by no means anywhere near represent all the varieties that are available out there. You'll see Riviera and Hollywood and Yukon. They've got that RG real good designation. I've grown some of the Riviera and the Yukon. They're both very, very nice grasses, okay, in terms of texture and quality and so on. Here you see common Bermuda grass. Common Bermuda grass typically has a wider leaf blade, and very often and this is not a good representation, that this image is not, but if you look at a stolon, one of those above ground lateral running stems, pull a stolon up and look at it, and there's a fair amount of space between the upright vertical shoots on that stolon, whereas on the improved common types or the hybrid types, there's a lot less space. The nodes are closer together, so you've got more vertical shoots, per foot of stolon out there. So it makes a denser grass. But common Bermuda grass, it can make a very dense and attractive turf also. But from a seed standpoint, it's going to be cheaper than the improved seeded varieties are. Just like Kentucky 31 is typically a cheaper tall fescue seed than the improved turf type tall fescues are. Here's an example of Riviera Bermuda grass. That's a seeded Bermuda grass variety. You compare it back to the texture on the common, and granted, the common's pulled up, you see a good close shot of it. But you look at that Riviera, even from even this picture, it looks to be finer texture not as coarse bladed as does the common Bermuda grass. Here's some zoysia grass. You know, zoysia grass, that's another species entirely. It's a durable, heat-loving, creeping, running turf grass, and durable. It's durable. It has good wear tolerance, and it loves the heat, hot weather. But it is not as aggressive. It doesn't grow as fast as does Bermuda grass. So for that reason, you may see a difference if you're thinking, okay, I like warm season grass. I've got sun. It tolerates the heat very well. Instead of Bermuda grass sod, I want to look at price some zoysia grass sod. Well, generally, zoysia grass sod will be more expensive than Bermuda grass sod because it does grow slower, and it takes a sod producer longer to bring a field of zoysia grass into production than it does a field of Bermuda grass. So that's probably the reason if there's a primary reason why there's a price difference between Bermuda grass sod and zoysia grass sod. There are some varieties of zoysia grass that are much more shade tolerant than Bermuda grass. Some of these will grow in some light shade. And that can be an option for folks that want a warm season grass like Bermuda grass, but they do have some shade that's fairly light. And I'll talk about on trees where they've gone through and they've limbed those trees up so that they don't have lots of limbs close to the ground. And they've maybe thinned the canopies out a little bit so that as the sun traverses across the sky, sunlight can get down to the base of the tree and it can filter through the canopy and hit the ground. Around those trees, zoysia grass could be grown just around the trees in those shade zones, and then Bermuda grass and the rest of it. Yeah, they don't look exactly the same, but they grow the same time of the year. They're both warm season grasses. They tolerate heat very well. They're going to go dormant at the same time. Somebody driving by the street looking out there, they're probably not going to be, have a sharp enough eye to say, boy, there's something really different about the grass over here under this shade tree than it is over here in the full sun. I don't know, maybe they would be more discerning than that. But anyway, that is an option for folks that want to have a warm season grass, but do have some light shade, and zoysia grass can be an option for you. Just like on Bermuda grass, there are vegetatively propagated types that don't produce enough seed. These are examples of zoysia grass varieties that have to be established from sod or from plugs. These you'll see listed with the ST are shade tolerant. Cavalier is more shade tolerant. El Toro is a more shade tolerant zoysia grass. Xeon is, Zorro is, Palisades not listed here. There's one called and there's lots of them. These are by far, just like Bermuda grass. These are not the only options out there. Okay, not the only options. And this is an example of Meyer Bermuda grass, or excuse me, zoysia grass. Meyer Z52. There you see it listed right there. It's called Z52. Z stands for zoysia, and 52, that was the year that it was released into the market. So that's been around a while. Some of these zoysia grass varieties or species, because there's multiple species in the zoysia grass world. Some of them have a high fiber content, and so that it makes the grass blades want to stand up really good. And you're seeing that on this Meyer zoysia grass. Very vertical growth habit, but notice the ends of the blades are kind of ragged. It takes a good sharp mower blade on some of these zoysia grass varieties to make a clean cut. So that's something to keep in mind. There are seeded types of zoysia grass out there. You'll see these listed here. There's Cathay, Chinese Common, Companion, Zenith. My experience with it, it's kind of slow growing from seed. I've grown some of the Zenith in from seed here in plots. It makes a pretty decent grass. There's some right there. That's Zenith zoysia grass, but it is kind of slow to grow in compared to say Bermuda grass or one of the cool season grass like tall fescue. Now, the last one we'll talk about on the warm season grass side is centipede grass. And here's an example of centipede grass you can see growing there. It's a heat tolerant grass, but it spreads by stolons, does not spread by rhizomes, so it only creeps above the ground. And it does have a little shade tolerance, but it is not nearly as drought tolerant as Bermuda grass or zoysia grass is. It will start to show drought stress much faster than will Bermuda or zoysia. My experience with it, I equate it to being closer to tall fescue in terms of, it's starting to go off color a little bit after it goes for a while without a drink of water in hot weather. It'll tolerate the heat as long as it gets the adequate moisture. It does great because it's a warm season grass. But a good quality of it is it'll grow in poor soil. infertile ground has a much lower nitrogen requirement than Bermuda grass or zoysia grass does. So, and it's being used some more in Tennessee. For years, it wasn't really cold tolerant enough to survive consistently with any kind of confidence. But several years ago, Tiff Blair was established, Tiff Blair seeded variety, back up. And it was developed to be a cold tolerant centipede grass. And that's what this is. I've got a plot of Tiff Blair centipede grass that I've had growing here at Land Agri Park, I guess going on 10 years now. And it survived the winters just fine. But it will show drought stress if it goes too long without water, in the summertime. And that is a seeded variety, Tiff Blair is. That's a seeded variety. Okay, so we've talked about warm season grasses, cool season grasses, the growth characteristics, creeping grasses, bunch grasses, and so on. So then a common question that people will ask, and maybe they'll ask you as a master gardener because, you know stuff, you're a master gardener. So they'll say, well, can I grow perennial warm and perennial cool season grasses together? Obviously, the answer is yes. It's America. You can do whatever you want to with it on your ground, okay? But if you do, at some point in the year, it's going to be patchy looking. You're going to have the cool season grass is going to be green and actively growing. The warm season grass is going to be inactive and it's going to be brown. Okay, so when you have both warm season and cool season, perennial grasses growing on the same site, it will not be uniform year round because there's going to be points when some of it's brown and some of it's green. There'll also be points or a period when it's all green, it'll look pretty uniform. But, just throw that out there because folks will often ask that. So we've talked about the different kinds of grasses available. So now we got to get these things in the ground and get them up and grow it. So how do we plant these? Well, there are options to plant. There's more than one way to establish it. But in the, I guess in the whole scheme of things, a person can really make great strides or do things to ensure or give their home lawn a better chance of being successful, establishing it successful, and maintaining it for years to come. If during the construction phase they'll take the pains, to get things done right. And so, what does that mean? What does done right look like? Well, if the building lot is going to have a fair amount of grading work done to it, and there's topsoil on the ground, okay. You don't want that topsoil to leave, but consolidate the topsoil. A lot of grading has to be done so that it doesn't get all mixed up with everything else. Push it up in a pile. And then once the grading is done and everything, the subgrade gets contoured the way it needs to be, then come back in there and scarify that layer of subsoil, okay? You scrape the topsoil off of it, you put it in the pile, and then redistribute that topsoil out there over that scarified subsoil. And the reason we'll scarify it some is because we want, typically there may be a little texture difference between the topsoil and the subsoil, and we want those two to not form just distinct lines of separation between the two. We want to kind of let them meld together a little bit, and scarifying that subsoil prior to grading the topsoil back out over is a way to do that. If you want to improve the quality of your topsoil by adding organic matter, it's much easier to do that during the construction phase than it is after a lawn or a yard has already been established. And that's what this handful of compost down here represents. It's certainly much easier to till a couple to 2 to 4 inches of compost into that existing bare ground before you try to establish a turf on it than it is after the fact. You want to incorporate the recommended amounts of lime, if need be, to adjust soil pH prior to trying to establish the lawn. Also, the starter fertilizer recommendation from your soil test report. Have that tilled in to the upper couple of inches of the topsoil before you try to plant the new grass out there in that yard. And also make sure that it's free, from junk. You don't have stones out there. You don't have rocks in that top 2 to 4 inches of ground, because you got rocks there. That's a space you're not going to have grass roots, and that's a space that's not going to hold air, it's not going to hold water for those grass plants or any other plants that you try to grow in the yard. So you want it to be pretty uniform, clean, and freed up. So during the construction phase is the time to do that. When the grading is done, when the subgrade is done, and topsoil is redistributed, it needs to be redistributed evenly. Okay, so the top of the slope to the bottom of the slope, the depth of the soil should be the same. Not that it gets thinner as we get out towards the bottom of the slope. So that's sometimes that's a mistake that is sometimes made in grading a yard with a slope on it. The topsoil gets really thin down at the bottom because the person doing the grading did not maintain, even depth from the top of the grade to the bottom of the grade. So in the case like this, you may find, and maybe this is down by the sidewalk, by the driveway or something, where the topsoil is thinned out. But the grass won't grow as good there. Well, because the topsoil is not as deep. That'd be the reason. Folks say, well, I got this new yard and the grass won't grow down by the driveway. Sometimes that's the reason why. So pay attention to things like that. And granted, sometimes we don't have any say in the matter. But if you do have a say in it, then for sure try to make sure that happens. When you're preparing a planting bed on a new lawn, you want to get the soil, get the grade right, get it all distributed, the topsoil distributed evenly, work in any amendments that you need to, whether it's compost, the fertilizers recommended via the soil test. And you want to plant into a relatively firm bed, okay? This good, clean bed, clean meaning free from debris and from rocks and junk and weeds, etc. But it should be firm. What's firm? Well, firm is if you can walk across that bed, that planting bed, and not make a footprint deeper than a ½ inch, that's firm. Okay. If you're making footprints deeper than a ½ inch, it's probably a little bit soft, and you want to firm it up. The reason being, you're planting a very small seed out there, and if you bury that seed too deeply, which is much easier to do in a really soft seed bed, then you may damage. You're going to take away some of the germination potential. Some of that grass seed may germinate, but may not have enough strength to push all the way up through that however much soil you've got over the top of it, because you planted into a really soft seed bed, and some of that stuff got buried a little bit. So if the bed is a little bit soft, how do you firm it up? Roll it. Okay, rollers are good. You see a corrugated roller over here. If you look at my mouse pointer on the screen, and you've got a smooth roller down here on the bottom. Not everybody owns a roller. I don't own a roller. Most folks don't, but you can rent those things down at equipment rental stores. Take them home. If you've got a yard project that you need to use a roller in preparation of a planting bed, the smooth rollers like this drum type here in the bottom picture, the guy's pushing, typically they have a plug in them. They're just a barrel. And you can take that plug out, add water to it, give it some weight, increase the weight if you need to, or make it as heavy as you need to make it in order to make a good firm seed bed. And also, if you get the right kind of roller, it can be great exercise. So you can do good things for your yard, and you can also do good things for yourself by rolling the yard out there. And then, so you get the seed bed prepared, we got to plant the seed. Okay. There's not a single best way to do that, I guess. I mean, seed have been planted lots of different ways over the years. You see down on the left-hand side here, there's no black and white picture of a gentleman out there sowing seed by hand. There have been lots of acres of grass planted in the South or in the United States, not just in the Southeastern United States, been planted by hand, broadcast by hand. And it doesn't matter how you do it, just so long as you broadcast, you apply the correct amount of seed per unit of area, and you do it uniformly. So it can be done via hand, via broadcast spreader, via a push type broadcast spreader. It can be a push type drop spreader, a pull type drop spreader, a combination aerator, seeder, the old fashioned over the shoulder cyclone seeders, tractor mounted spreaders, etc. The point is, you just want to put the correct amount of seed uniformly over the unit of area. And those grass seed need to come in contact with the soil. They don't have to be buried very deeply. You can see in this slide, those seed are germinating and they're not buried, or many of them are not buried. They're up there on the surface of the ground. You can also see, some of the prills of the slow release fertilizer that was applied out there also. A way to help improve seed and soil contact is through the use of a roller. After planting the grass seed, after you broadcast it, then go over that seed bed with a roller. And if you've got it firmed up pretty good to begin with, that's typically going to push that seed deep enough into the ground to suffice. It doesn't have to be planted very deeply. You know, after you get the seed planted, you got it rolled in. You know, folks will say, do I need to mulch it? Do I need to put straw on it? Well, straw can certainly help. Straw mulch can help kind of stabilize the ground after planting. It might limit under rain conditions, you know, some of that seed from floating because, you know, if it's just on bare ground, it gets pretty good rain on it. Some of that seed can become dislodged and float and moved around. So the straw can help stabilize the soil. It will help keep the soil from drying out so fast once it does get wet. But you can use too much straw. You know, a 50-pound bale of straw, if you'll spread it out the way it should be, will cover 1,000 square feet of yard space. And 50 pounds over 1,000 square feet is not going to cover the ground up entirely so that you can't see bare ground. You're going to still see bare ground out there. You just want to uniformly spread that out so that you've got a pretty good cover over it. Yeah, you may see, you know, on this slide, you can see some wide bladed grass growing up. Well, looks to be wheat. This is probably wheat straw. There was some wheat seed in there. It comes up with the straw or with the grass seed too, because it's a grass seed as well. You know, wheat's a grass, but it's an annual and it will die. So don't worry about that. You don't rake the straw up. Okay, you don't rake it up. It's going to decompose over time. You don't worry about it when the grass is big enough to mow. You mow it, whether the straw's there or not. You mow it, and it'll, you know, the mower will chop up grass with straw, and it'll help it decompose by chopping it up even finer. If the straw say does get windrowed, for example, under heavy wind conditions, you know, come spread it back out again, because you don't want it so thick that it interferes with that seedling once it germinates from reaching up through that straw and getting to the sunlight so it can start to make its own energy. So you don't want a super heavy dense layer of straw on there. So if it does get windrowed via the wind or maybe heavy rain and it kind of washes up some and makes the windrow, especially on slope places, that's when you think about, you know, spreading that straw back out again. On slope grounds, you know, there are hydro seeders. This is an example of a hydro seeder that's used for hillsides and so on. Now, you know, I've never seen this used in a home lawn, not in the state of Tennessee. I've seen it used on some commercial property, see it used on highways, on steep road banks and whatnot. It's a pretty good concept, though, I think. You've got a gun back here, if you will, okay, right back here. This tank has a mixture of some kind of, it's got water in it, okay, and then it's going to have, they make a slurry with some grass seed in there, maybe some fertilizer, and then also, you know, some material, mulching material. It might be some cellulose material ground up finely. Anyway, this is all mixed up and make kind of a slurry, and so this stuff goes out as a spray, and it just kind of sticks on the hill, on the slope, and it's got the mulch mixed in there with it. And that cellulose mulch kind of acts like the straw mulch does, kind of helps conserve moisture, but also on heavy sloped areas. Then there are erosion control mats, which are made of, you know, fine curl wood shaving, celsius, which are glued to biodegradable netting, and those can be rolled out over the slope and held in place with landscape stakes or spikes. To help keep the ground from eroding until those seed that were put out there via the hydro seeding begin to germinate. And again, that's all biodegradable. It breaks down over time. So that can be a good use or a good option on heavily sloped areas. You know, we talk about a lot of different kinds of grass seed, of grasses, and if we're going to plant them, so it's a good idea to know a little bit about their seed. So you see listed here, or so shown here on this slide, different turf grass seeds. Beginning over here on the left side, you got tall fescue, annual ryegrass, perennial ryegrass. As we move closer to the graph, to the vertical axis bar, zoysia grass, Kentucky bluegrass, centipede grass, and Bermuda grass. And the scale over here is in millimeters. So you see that hull of Bermuda grass seed says hull, so the outside coating been knocked off of it. You know, a millimeter in height, I guess, or length, I guess. Centipede grass, a tick under 2 millimeters, all the way over here to this tall fescue. And shoot, it's coming in up here between, you know, like 5.5. So some of these seed are very small and some are much larger. Well, the size of the seed has a lot to do, well, it has everything to do with how many seed are in a pound of seed. And so the seed count per pound influences what the planting rate is. Okay, so this gives you an idea of approximate number of these different grass species seeds in a pound. You look at Bermuda grass, unhulled, it's still got the outer coating on it, 1.6 million seed in a pound. Hull Bermuda grass, 2.1 million seed. That tells you it's a pretty small seed, a lot of seed in a pound. You compare that to tall fescue, 230,000, 250,000 seed in a pound compared to 2.1 million seed. Zoysia grass, pretty small seed, 1 million in a pound. The creeping red fescue, it's pretty small seed, 400,000, a little less than 500,000. Chewings fescue, pretty small, 500,000. Kentucky bluegrass, pretty doggone small, 1.7 million. Centipede grass, pretty small, 600,000. So ryegrass and tall fescue, very similar in size. The fine fescues, they're kind of intermediate, I guess, between the big seeded fescues and ryegrasses, compared, to the very fine seeded grasses like Bermuda grass and zoysia and Kentucky bluegrass. But that influences how many pounds of seed you're going to apply per 1,000 square feet area. And that's typically talking about lawns, okay, lawn care. We talk in units typically of 1,000 square feet. So yard may have 10,000 square feet, it may have 15,000, maybe 5,000 square feet. Okay, but regardless, the seeding rate is typically expressed in pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet of yard space. Another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at grass seed is the label can tell you a lot about the seed. Okay, it's going to tell you what the variety of seed is. It will tell you the purity of that seed. Here you see an example. It's called Speedway Tall Fescue. And tells you that's 99.58% pure. That's pretty darn pure. There's not much stuff in there other than seed. It tells you this 0.09% other crop. Well, what is that? Well, it might be, there might be an orchard grass seed in there, okay, or some other crop seed. It says there's some inert matter, 0.27. Lord knows what that is. And then weed seed, 0.06%. But none of those weeds are noxious weeds. If there were any noxious weeds in there, for example, like Johnson grass or red sheep sorrel or something like that, it would say that on the label. It would tell you what those noxious seed were. But so this is pretty darn pure seed. It also tells you where it originated. So this seed was grown in Oregon, okay, and it's got a germination rate of 90%. And it tells you when it was tested. This seed was tested on in May of 2015. So this is an older tag right here we're looking at. When you're buying seed, you want to buy fresh seed. You typically want the seed you plant 2021, you want germ tested 2021. The 2022 seed, you'd prefer it to be germ tested in 2022. So you've got a current germination rate on. If seed's stored right, it can last for a while. But if it's going to be stored for long periods of time, it needs to be in a cold setting because heat will cause the germination percentage to degrade over time. So you want to buy fresh seed, okay? And the tag will tell you that. It will also, when you look at what the purity of the seed is and what the germination percentage is, you can also get an idea of what the pure live seed percentage is. And pure live seed is the estimated percentage by weight of that seed that will germinate when planted. Okay, so pure live seed is purity percentage times germination percentage divided by 100. So if we're looking at this grass seed right here, and it's a good way to keep this in mind to compare grass seeds, especially prices. Okay, so if this grass seed, the retail price is $1.65 per pound. All right, that's for every seed in there. And knowing that some of those are not going to germinate because it's only got a 90% germination rate, but it's 99.58% pure. So what's the pure live seed? So pure live seed is 99.58% pure. Okay, the percentage of purity times the germination rate. Well, germination rate's 90% divided by 100. So 99.58 times 90, okay, is 62.2. Divide that by 100 is 89.62. So it's got a pure live seed percentage of 89.62% pure live seed. So every 89 pounds of that 100 pound, every out of every 100 pounds of that seed, 89%, 89 pounds of it is pure live seed you expect to germinate. So if you now convert your price to pure live seed, if the retail was $1.65, so you divide that by the PLS, $1.65 by 89.62 times 100, then that puts the cost at $1.84 per pound of pure live seed. So you compare that to one, maybe it has an 85% germination rate and a 90% purity. And your price per pound, and maybe it was, selling for $1.40. Well, the price per pound for pure live seed on that grass might be higher than it is on this one. Okay, even though the retail price was a little bit cheaper. So that's just something to keep in mind and look at when you're comparing seed prices. When you're looking at seed packages, seed bags, anymore, it's not that common to find just a single variety being sold out there, especially in the tall fescues, well, in the cool season grasses particularly. You're very often going to, or most often you're going to see offered as a blend. And all a blend means is there's more than one variety of the same species packaged together in a bag. So you see listed here, this is an example from the Rebels company, their Southern Classic Tall Fescue Blend. If you look at it, they use 4 different tall fescue varieties to package that blend. And it's got the percentage of pure seed for each of those, and it tells you what the germination percentage is for each of those varieties. And it's the country, or not the country, but state of origin. That, again, a big lot of all of our cool season grass seed is grown in Oregon. And you'll find, in the Pacific Northwest, it's good conditions, good environment typically for growing cool season grasses. And you'll see warm season grasses being grown in places like Arizona and whatnot, Bermuda grass seed. And tells you down here about other crop seed, inert matter, weed seed, noxious weed seed, etc. But that's what a blend is. 2 or more varieties of the same species packaged together. I think blends make good sense. They're all the same species, that's true, but there is some genetic diversity because not every variety is exactly the same as the next one. So you do have some diversity in the genetics versus growing just a single variety. And I think that it never hurts to have some diversity out there. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread your risk out just a little bit. Now you're also going to find a lot of coated seed. Here's an example of Scott's Turf Builder grass seed, their Southern Gold mix with Water Smart Plus coating technology. You got to pay attention on stuff like this because look at your, and they use 3 different tall fescues, Tar Heel, Wolfpack, and Endeavor tall fescue. All 3 of those got an 85% germination rate that came from Oregon. That's where they're produced. Well, look here, 17%, 17.06, 17.06, and 14.62 percentage pure seed. Well, you add that up, that's about what, 48, 49%. What's the rest of it? 50% of the weight, okay, is Water Smart Plus fertilizer coating. Well, what is that coating? Well, it can be a water absorbent material. So that it's coated around that seed with a little fertilizer mixed with it. Might even have a little fungicide mixed in there with it. The idea is it will absorb water and hold it around that seed to maybe ensure better germination. But it's taking up a lot of space, making that seed bigger. And it's adding some weight to it. So, you've only got about half of this bag is seed and the other half is coating compared to an uncoated seed. So if you're going to plant 8 pounds, of seed, okay, and you buy a 50-pound bag and it's a 50 pound of uncoated seed, it'll cover a lot more ground than 50 pounds of coated seed will, because you don't have near as many seed in a 50-pound bag of coated seed as you have in a 50-pound bag of uncoated seed. So that's something to keep in mind, especially when you start shopping prices. You got to compare apples to apples. And a coated seed is not the same as a non-coated seed. From a germination rate standpoint, I see them germinate just as fast out here on bare ground plots, uncoated seed, as I do the coated seed. It may be, from a survivability standpoint, long term, I haven't seen a lot of difference in it. There may be some benefit to you for the coating. Okay, but just keep that in mind that there's fewer seed in a pound of coated seed versus a pound of uncoated seed. These are suggested seeding rates for your different, for common turf grasses, the cool season grasses up here, you know, the fescues, and that's your fines and your tall fescues too, anywhere from 5 to 8 pounds. And we're talking about on new establishment, okay, 5 to 8 pounds per 1,000 feet. Kentucky bluegrass, 1.5 to 2 pounds. Perennial ryegrass, 4 to 6. On Bermuda grass, and we got an asterisk there, and it says if you're using unhulled seed or seed that has a husk on it, you double the rate. Now remember, the unhulled seed had 1.6 million per pound, where the hulled seed had 2.1 million per pound. So you got a lot more seed in a pound of unhulled, or in a pound of hulled, than you do unhulled. So Bermuda grass, a half pound to a pound. So you got a lot of seed in a pound. Okay, so a pound of hulled seed, you put 2.1 million seed per 1,000 square feet. And if you look at tall fescue, about 250,000 seed per pound. If so 8 pounds, put out 2 million seed per 1,000 square feet. So, you know, well, there's a lot difference in poundage, but seed count, not much difference in them. And the same thing's going to be true with the centipede grass, a 1/2 to 3 pounds per 1,000 feet, and zoysia grass, a 1/2 to 3 pounds per 1,000 feet. Those are your suggested seeding rates. So when you're looking at sowing area, you need to know what size it is, so you'll know how much seed to use. So you'll know how much seed to purchase, to acquire, to have on hand. You know, there's mathematical formulas. Boy, you think back when teachers said, you know, someday you will use this later in life, or your parents told you that, or somebody said someday you'll use this in life, and you're thinking, man, I don't ever use that stuff. Well, here's an example of maybe where they were right. You might use that. You might use this in life. So you've got these, you know, different mathematical formulas to help calculate areas of some different shapes, potentially, that you might find down in the lawn or landscape. Or you could also use one of the online measurement tools. Here's an example, one's from a company called Sod Solutions. If you can identify, and this is just an example of one. There's lots of different, Google Earth lets you do it, but there are other tools out there that you can use. That if you can identify the property in question via an overhead photograph, and you can plot those points on there, then this thing will measure it for you. So in this particular yard, you know, we got the 4 corners plotted on this front yard. Here's the house, driveway. And so looking at the front yard, this thing tells us there's 15,263.52 square feet in this front yard. Well, so I've measured that with the 100-foot tape measure as well. That's pretty darn close. So if you can identify your property from an overhead photograph, some of these online tools can speed things up for you. You don't have to remember all that math, and maybe so you can say, haha, I did not have to, I'm not going to use that later life, teacher. You might have been wrong. But anyway, that's up to you whether you do that or not. So once you figure out how many seed to plant, you plant seed. How long is this stuff going to take to germinate? It does take a little while. And so you can see here on these cool season grasses, kind of the number of days to germinate, and kind of the temperature range that is most suitable for germination. You look here at annual ryegrass, 3 to 7 days. That's pretty fast. Perennial ryegrass, 3 to 7 days, pretty fast. Tall fescue, 6 days to 12 days. You know, you figure, you know, a week to 2 weeks on tall fescue to germinate. Kentucky bluegrass, 14 to 21 days. One thing you'll notice is on smaller seeds, for whatever the reason, it seems like an inverse relationship. The smaller the seed, typically the longer it takes to germinate compared to a larger seeded grass. So the point is, you know, make sure your expectations are in line with what's really going to happen. You don't plant perennial, you don't plant Kentucky bluegrass, you know, today and expect to see it growing in 3 days. That's not going to happen. Under the right conditions, you know, the fastest I've ever seen it germinates 5 days. But it's going to be more in that week to 2 week range typically. And temperatures, you know, 68, 86 degrees. It's got a fairly wide temperature range. Notice Kentucky bluegrass will germinate at a little cooler temperature, as will some of those finer fescues like the creeping and sheep fescue. And so based on that, okay, when these grasses like to germinate, temperatures like to germinate at, that influences when we plant these grasses. So here's the cool season growth curve again. Well, we get over here in the fall of the year, okay, when things start cooling off, we get in that 68, 86 degree temperature range that many of these cool season grasses like. And we're going to find those more frequently over here in this September through October period than we would earlier in the year, okay, in the summertime. But say, well, what about springtime? Well, we have those temperatures in the spring. Yes, you do. But remember what we said about root growth. Root growth on these grasses will occur down to near freeze. So if we plant a cool season grass in middle of September, 1st of October, we get it germinated. Think of how many days that it potentially will have where the temperature is going to be above 32, 33 degrees before we get over here into the late springtime, May, middle of June time period, when things start to heat up, okay, when the temperature starts to rise. Think how much more time that cool season grass has to grow and mature and establish itself before heat stress comes. So you've got a fall planted grass is more mature, should be, you would expect it to be more mature, better developed, and thus more able to withstand the stresses of heat than one that you planted over here in March. Now, can you be successful and get grass seed, cool season grass to germinate in March? Absolutely you can. But it's a very immature grass when the hot weather conditions set in on it as compared to one that was planted back here in September, October time period. So that's the reason. At a field day once, and Turfgrass field day, and the speaker was talking, and he asked a question. He said, "When's the best time to plant tall fescue in Tennessee?" And this old guy says it's September. Okay, that's right. I agree with you. Speaker said. Then he says, "Okay, when's the second best time to plant tall fescue in Tennessee?" And he was figuring the guy was going to say, "Well, March, April." But no, he said next September is the second best time to do it. It might be kind of hard to argue with that. Fall planted cool season grasses just tend to be stronger and better able to withstand the stresses than do the spring planted grasses. So we look at warm season grasses, germination period, those are smaller seeded, so they typically take a little longer to germinate than do the cool season, bigger seeded cool season grasses. So Bermuda grass without the hull on it, 10 to 20 plus days. Zoysia grass, 10 to 14 days. Centipede grass, 10 to 20 plus days. And 65 to 90 degrees. That's where they want to be for germination. That's their preferred germination temperature. So when do we plant those grasses? We want to plant them past the danger of frost because, frost will damage warm season grasses. It causes them to go in a dormant state. And so if you have a brand new little seedling warm season grass planted, say, in the middle of April, and it comes a late frost or boom, it might kill it. So we want to kind of be past the most likely frost danger. So May, the early part of May through June is kind of the preferred planting time from a seeding standpoint on our warm season grasses. That gives it time to get germinated. Typically, very often we'll have a little more consistent moisture in the springtime of the year versus over here in the July and August time frame. It's certainly warm enough to germinate in July and August, and you got irrigation. It can, but you have less time for it to grow in and develop and be ready to withstand colder temperature on the warm season grass as we transition into fall. It's got less time if you plant it over here in this July, August frame and you've got irrigation to get it germinated versus when you planted it in May, June time frame. So that's the recommended time for the warm season grass establishment from seed. When you broadcast the seed, uniform distribution is key to get a uniform stand up. To help ensure that, you might consider applying half the seed in one direction and then apply the other half at the 90-degree angle to it. And that way you can offset any mistakes you made if you didn't overlap enough, you overlap too much, etc., things like that. That helps tend to compensate for some of those potential problems. The uniform seed distribution. And, these are showing, this is a broadcast, push type broadcast spreader. Here's an over-the-shoulder hand-operated broadcast spreader. Either one will work fine. You could use a drop spreader as well. The key is uniform distribution of the right amount of seed over the area. Now, there are machines, okay? This is a slip seeder. And those are typically used to plant into, to overseed into an established turf, but they, let's say that if you killed off an existing turf, like the lady we were speaking with before the class started, she killed all Bermuda grass off. Well, you could go in there with a slit seeder. Okay, you've got that dead stubble, and this is called a slit seeder. You've got these knives down here on the base underneath the machine. They cut slits and plant the grass seed in those slits. That's a way to interseed into existing stubble, or to introduce a new variety into an existing stand of grass. Maybe you wanted to interseed some fine fescue and this tall fescue over here in the shady area. Well, there's a way to do that. slit seeding tools or overseeding tools. For large areas, there are tractor mounted machines. They work like little no-till drills, but in essence, they plant the grasses in small rows. And then they're very narrow rows, and so as the grass grows and matures, the clumps grow together and it forms a very uniform appearance out there. So there's a lot of tools out there that can be used to plant seed or to establish grass from seed. Then sod is the quickest way or the fastest way to get grass cover on a site, because you are actually putting a blanket of grass out there. Because it is more expensive, you've got a lot more investment in it. Sod is very often used on areas that have access to irrigation, okay, because you are putting a substantial investment out there in many cases, and you want to do all you can to ensure that you don't lose that investment. So having the availability of irrigation and not relying strictly on rain is certainly an advantage for sodding an area. Sod is a crop. It's harvested, it's grown in the field, and it's one of the few crops that you actually harvest a little bit of the field when the crop is harvested. Now, for years and years, sod was cut as square cut sod, and that's what you see depicted here in this slide. It's sold by the pallet, and a pallet of square cut sod would usually going to be about 50 square yards. So that's 450 square feet. Some in the neighborhood of 450 to 500 feet, what you're going to have enough coverage for in a pallet of sod. Pallet of sod weighs a ton. You don't put that in the trunk of the car. And it's work to lay sod. These are small squares, and you can see them put together here. This is a perishable crop that's being grown. From the time that sod is harvested, in a perfect world, it would be installed within 48 hours. It does not get any better sitting on a pallet out there waiting to be installed. Okay, so the faster you can get it installed after it's harvested, the better it's going to be. But care needs to be taken. Slabs, the squares of sod should be installed in a brick-like pattern so that you're offsetting. You don't have seams lining up with one another. And that sod those pieces need to be pushed together so that you don't have these exposed seams. You can't see these bare ground seams out there. I mean, it's work to lay sod. You've got to get down. You've got to push it tight together so that you do away with those seams. And here's why: the exposed edges dry out. Okay, they get dry, and also you're exposing that bare soil. Well, if it stays exposed for a few days under the right conditions, you'll have crabgrass seeds starting to germinate down here in this native dirt that you've got exposed because you don't have any competition over it. You've got this open space. So you need to push those sod edges together and minimize ground exposure and not have lots of exposed seams. Today, a lot of sod is harvested in rolls, in big rolls. Big roll might be 125 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide. And so it takes some machinery. You don't typically roll those out by hand. But there's some advantages to using large rolls of sod. One is you got fewer seams. For every one of those 125 foot sections of sod, you've got 2 edges to it. All right. So, boom, you got seam on the left, seam on the right. Whereas with all those squares of sod, they got 4 edges. And so you got potential for more seams. So you can, reduce the number of seams by using large rolls of sod. But again, both can be fine. You just need to put them down the correct way. Plugging is basically where you plant small pieces of sod. If you took a square yard of sod and you cut that into 2 by 2 inch plugs, you'd have 300 plugs in 1 yard of sod. Okay. And those plugging is only effective on creeping grasses. You don't plug bunch grasses, because if these were bunch grasses, let's say they plugged this, if this were tall fescue, why anybody do that? I mean, it's because they didn't know. But if they plugged in tall fescue, those clumps are not going to grow together. But crabgrass and other junk that grow in here between them. But if you plug in a creeping grass like Bermuda grass, like zoysia grass, and boom, those plugs are going to start growing together because they creep and they spread, and you can use less plant material to establish, the same unit of area with a creeping grass by plugging than you could by sodding. Okay, and that's the advantage of it. That's the advantage. There's a lot of labor involved in it because every one of those plugs has to be put in the ground. You got to make a hole to put the plug in the ground. You want to plant them uniformly. You try to plant them, the closer you plant them together, the quicker they'll cover. Of course, the closer you plant them together, the more material it takes. The further you spread them apart, then you've got less material to use. But you've also got more exposed ground longer, because it's going to take longer for them to grow together because they're further apart, and that just gives more time for weeds and whatnot to grow into those bare spaces. But plugging can be, it's a viable option. It can work. Finally, the last way we'll speak about is sprigging. And that's where the stolons, okay, those above ground portions are they're cut, they're harvested. Those sections of stolons and these sprigs, okay, this is live plant material, just like sod is, just like plugs are. And those sprigs are planted. Here's a sprig planting machine. Sprigging is typically done on large areas, but can it be done on a home lawn? Yes, it can. It can be done by hand, okay? It can be done by hand. Instead of having a sprig planting tool, you can prepare a seed bed for a new yard, just like you would to plant seed. And then, you buy the sprigs and you spread those sprigs out there by hand, and then come back and using some tool, whether it's a disc or, just a very light rototilling, to help incorporate or to bury, half to, or at least a third of that sprig, put it under the ground. You can plant them that way in small areas. Is it easy to do? No, it's not easy. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of volume. It may take as many as 10 bushels of sprigs to establish 1,000 feet of ground. But it can be much cheaper than sod, and it can be cheaper than plugging. And it may be a little easier work because you don't have a stoop labor. You just broadcast, you prepare the seed bed, you broadcast them out by hand, spread them out, and then you're going to come back and somehow incorporate those so that you do bury a portion of those sprigs in the ground. And then you get water in the right temperature, they start to grow. Here's an example. Okay, look at this area inside this this pipe square. On June the 13th, these are sprigs. It looks like dead grass out there, right? Well, thankfully it's not. Okay, on July the 7th, you can see, and this is Bermuda grass, and you can see that it's got a fair amount of coverage out there, the old dead brown stuff. Actually, it is alive. And then on August 17th, boom, she's grown in. It's pretty good dense turf. That's a fairly, economical way to establish, to vegetatively establish a creeping grass onto a large area. Again, you don't see it used much in home lawns. Not to say that it could not be. Not to say that it could not be. So after you plant this stuff, what do we do for it? Well, it's going to require some management. If you sowed it, if you planted from seed, if you sprigged it, boy, that grass, that you need to put water out there real soon. The surface needs to be moistened to promote seed germination, and also to promote those sprigs, to start to grow again and start to put down roots, start to put out runners, and begin to cover the area. It may be necessary to sprinkle it, multiple times in the course of a day to keep that soil surface damp out there. From a seed standpoint, once the seed starts to take in or to imbibe enough water to swell, that's what initiates germination. You don't want it to dry out after germination has started, because that's when that can kill a seed. So sprinkling, a couple to 3 times per day, just enough to keep the surface damp where those seed or where those sprigs are, can be necessary. Once you get germination and the plants, those little seedlings start to form roots, then you slow down the frequency of irrigation, but you increase the duration, so that when you irrigate, you are doing more than just trying to irrigate or wet the surface. Now you're trying to irrigate more deeply into the soil, so that you're wetting the soil profile and putting some moisture deeper, encourage those roots to go down there after that water, not just stay up here on the top. So, a goal might be to, put an inch of water out there, ½ inch at a time, a couple of times a week, okay, per 1,000-foot area. Another thing to keep in mind is at some point, hopefully, if everything's successful, you're gonna have to start mowing this grass. Well, when do you start mowing? Well, when it needs it. So when does it need? Typically, you'd like for the grass plants to be about 1.5 times what the intended mowing height is. So let's say if it's tall fescue and you want to mow it at 3 inches, when that grass is 4.5 inches tall, it's time to mow it. Okay, cut 1.5 inches off. If the weather after germination, after this grass starts to come in, okay, if there's going to be expect weather that will favor plant growth, for another 4 to 5 weeks or so after planting, an additional application of nitrogen fertilizer at this time can be beneficial to help encourage it to grow and continue to develop. And anytime you want to watch for disease, watch for insect damage, any weeds that may be popping up out there, those problems are typically easier to deal with when they're a small problem, when it's a young weed, okay, when it's just a little bit of disease versus a large insect population, or versus larger mature weeds and so on. So that's you're just taking care of it. You're tending to it. You're trying to grow it in, and that's in your hand to do that, to follow those practices to make that happen. Okay, we've gone through a lot of material, a lot of information about the different kinds of grasses, their characteristics, how they grow, kind of how we can plant these things, different ways to establish them. So why don't I stop right there for just a minute, give people a chance to stretch their legs, maybe stand up, get a drink, something like that. Carla, what do you say we take just a real short break before we start talking about maintaining these grasses in the yards after we get them established? Well, I'm not getting much response there from Carla, so I will just go ahead and tell you folks that we're going to take a little break right here. And according to my watch, it looks like it is about 7:40. Okay. Why don't we take 5 minutes? 7:45. We'll start back again and continue with our discussion on maintaining grasses once we've got them established. Okay. Well, again, look at my watch. It looks like 7:45, so I'm going to go ahead and get started back. So I've had a chance to maybe look through the chat here during this break, and been a couple of questions there. Let's see. Amanda asked, "What are some noxious weeds common to this area?" And that would be like things you might find, be on the lookout for in grass seed. I mentioned one Johnson grass. That would be a noxious seed. That you would not want to find in your grass seed mix. So like buckhorn plantain would be one you'd not want to find in there. And there are a lot of weeds. The state of Tennessee, I think, maintains a list of noxious weeds. If you want to look into more about what some of those are, but for the most part, you're typically not going to find those in grass seed. So that's a good thing, but it is not uncommon to see, especially in lower quality seed, some weed seeds in there. I've seen actually seed tags that had listed, like maybe six of buckhorn plantain seed per pound of grass seed, or maybe 3 red sheep sorrel seed per pound of grass seed. But that's not that common. And when you get into the more pure varieties, and purity can range all over the board. So on lower quality seed, lower price seed, it might be down below 90% pure, and it's in cases like that when you expect to see more junk showing up in there. Another question: do you recommend, this from Vicky Kruger, do you recommend yearly top dressing with organic matter like compost in addition to chemical fertilization when yearly aeration is done? And we're going to talk about top dressing, I promise, so I'll hold off on that one. Question: when using grass seed that was coated, will we have to figure out how much to sow, what the sow rate is, or will it be adjusted by the manufacturer to compensate? Typically, those labels or those coated products will tell you, have on there this bag of seed, you should sow this seed at X pounds per unit of area. So yes, they direct you as kind of the use rate for those coated seed. There, Carla just put up the noxious weed list. This by the this maintained, so you can take a look at that. So noxious weeds and invasive plants are synonyms. I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that. Carla, would you say that noxious and invasive are used? Those words used as synonyms?
Well, I would consider them pretty much the same thing.
I do, but I don't know if that's
usually our noxious weeds are invasives that have been brought over here, from different countries for some reason, like kudzu and erosion.
To be noxious, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a particularly dangerous plant, poisonous or anything like that to be noxious.
Right.
I use them. I use the words interchangeably, but
yeah,
I sometimes say things that are not right. So I wasn't going to say that's I'm not the definitive answer on that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Well, I think I've got all the questions caught up. And Vicky just pointed out the fact that there's some weeds, discussion about weeds, or some information about weeds in pages 42 through 45 in your chapter 10 on turfgrass management, Master Gardener literature. Okay, so we got this grass established. Now we got to maintain it. When we think about turf management, we're really talking about the maintenance of 3 different zones. We're talking about maintaining the aerial shoots, the vertical shoots we see above the ground, a thatch layer, and we'll discuss what that is in just a few minutes, and also the below ground layer where the roots and the rhizomes are, because they all go together to make this plant community. So from a maintenance standpoint, we can divide maintenance practices up into primary things, and those are the ones that we do on a regular basis. And there's 3 primary practices. Generally, people will recognize 3 practices: mowing, fertilization, irrigation. And then we've got supplementary practices that are not done nearly as often. Things like dethatching, top dressing, aerification. Then you get into pest management, and those are not hopefully don't have to be done nearly as often as the primary practices do. So let's start talking about primary practices. We'll begin with mowing. And hopefully, you know, most people are not going to have the same experience this gentleman has in this slide with mowing. And you know, I doubt, or maybe you all do, but I suspect that there's a lot of folks that maybe don't take mowing to the extreme that this person has, where they're using it to express, you know, their artistic side. But hopefully you'll fall kind of somewhere in between anyway. You know, in between this guy back here that, you know, it's like I fought the lawn and the lawn won kind of a situation, to someone over here that, you know, possibly has used the GPS to guide the mower to make sure that all the cross patterns here and the stripes were uniformly laid out with correct spacing all the way throughout each arc and circle and so on. When do we mow grasses? Well, we mow when they need to be mowed. And there are definite mowing seasons. On cool season grasses, and the cool season grasses, if you look at here's that growth chart again. You know, you got your spring peak, you got a summer slump, and then you've got a fall peak again, and then a winter slump or winter fall off. You mow when it's growing. Okay, so spring and fall are going to be the most busy times for folks that are mowing cool season grasses. And looking at this chart, you know, this lets us know that cool season grasses have the potential to give us the greatest number of days of green grass color compared to the warm season grasses, because we see the warm season grasses here. You know, typically just a shorter mowing season. I mean, for Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, it's going to be May really before it's growing enough to be mowed with any kind of consistency, or to need to be mowed with any kind of consistency. And it slows off as we start getting into September. I mean, I have Bermuda grass right now. I mean, it has slowed down a bunch in the last, you know, 3 weeks. In the last 3 weeks, you know, I've mowed tall fescue, ryegrass, etc., those cool season grasses on a weekly basis, and maybe mowing Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, you know, every 2 weeks or even longer in some cases. So they really start slowing down as we get over here into the shorter day periods and the cooler days as well. So we mow when they're actively growing. So there is a definite mowing season. Now, mowing stresses grass. Okay, I mean, it damages grass plant. It does. I mean, it physically removes a portion of the grass blade that the plant uses to catch sunlight in order to photosynthesize and make energy. So when you knock off or you remove a chunk of that sunlight receptor, then that stresses the plant, and it kind of knocks it out of kilter there for hopefully just for a short period of time, and causes it to draw on energy reserves out of the root system in order to shoot back out, you know, a spurt of new growth to get some new leaf tissue out there so that it can get fired back up and get photosynthesizing again like it was before you cut some of the grass blade off. But these plants that we use as turf grasses have been selected and identified as turf grasses because they have shown to tolerate frequent defoliation. Maybe by animal grazing and so on. But these grasses, as long as they are maintained at a height appropriate for that species, then they can survive and persist and actually do better in terms of quality appearance, just overall appearance and quality by mowing than if they were just left unmowed. But there are recommended mowing heights for those, and we want to try to stay within those mowing height ranges. So you can see mowing height ranges up here for cool season species on top, warm season species on the bottom. And under the best growing conditions for the different kinds of grasses, that's when they can be mown at a lower height of cut versus the less favorable growing conditions. So in cool season grasses, you know, in a cool humid weather, like in the spring, you know, you can typically mow those at a lower height of cut. Whereas you get into more stressful periods, like hot, dry conditions on cool season grasses, then that's when you start thinking about raising the lawnmower up and not mowing them off so short. Now I've got the tall fescue here highlighted with yellow, and I did that simply because, you know, if you're going to maintain if you're going to maintain those cool season grasses, like tall fescue, for example, if you're going to maintain tall fescue at 2 to 3 inches in height, when that stuff is really growing fast, I mean, in the spring of the year and even in the fall of the year under good fertility, they'll grow half inch, 3/4 inch a day. It's hard to mow them often enough to maintain them at that 2-inch range or 2.5 inches. I mean, you can't do that just mowing once a week. And so I hesitate to say that, boy, you need to strive for that 2 inches, because most folks, or many people, don't have, the time or the opportunity to mow 2 or 3 times a week in order to keep from cutting off too much grass blade at a time. Because that's one of the keys to mowing. That's a rule. The 1/3 rule. You try to remove no more than a third of the length of the grass blade at a time, because that will minimize the amount of stress you create. That minimizes the amount of damage, and the grass tends to regrow faster, put out new leaf tissue, and get started back to photosynthesizing the way it ought to be. And then in the hot, dry weather, if tall fescue, if you've been maintaining it at 3 inches, it turns off hot and it's dry, or it's heating up, and rain's not coming as frequently as it once did. Well, maybe raising that height to cut up even more to create a taller canopy over the ground surface to provide a little more shade there may slow down the loss of that water. So maybe going up to 4 inches or maybe 4.5 inches might be desirable. But these are the recommended mowing heights under good conditions and under less favorable conditions. And you'll notice that the warm season, the sod forming grasses, such as Bermuda grass, such as Kentucky bluegrass, it's a sod former, it's up there on the cool season side. They can typically be mowed at shorter heights of cut than can the cool season grasses. Now, in a perennial ryegrass under overseeding, it's so mowing it 1 inch, 2 inches. Well, that's because you're sowing it into Bermuda grass, right? And so Bermuda grass is being mowed at that low height of cut too. So when they're both growing, you're going to mow it to maintain the Bermuda grass height. So that's what you strive for. You use the lower heights of cut during the good growing conditions, and you raise the mower up under stressful conditions. And it could even get to a point that you just need to stay off of it entirely. If it gets hot enough, dry enough on cool season grasses, especially, you run equipment over it, and you create tire marks there. For dead grass, you can see the tire marks where you went, because you shouldn't have gotten on it anyway under those conditions. But the point is, you don't want to keep scalping that grass down low. Don't consistently cut it too short. That forces the grass to use stored energy out of the root system instead of manufacturing its own energy via photosynthesis. And that just shortens the lifespan of the population, causes it to thin out, and you've got to go back in and do some renovation work to thicken that stand back up again. Now, it's to show you that there is a direct correlation between the amount of material growing above the ground and growing beneath the ground. I think this is one of the best pictures I've ever seen. These are soil columns, and they're plexiglass in these wood frames, and it's showing, and this is perennial ryegrass. That's what this is. Over here on the left side, the tallest cut. Look how much more dense and how deep that root system is compared to the one in the middle. It just as we compare these different heights of cut to one another, we got tall, we got medium, we got low. Okay, but even this medium, I mean, this is kind of low. It's probably not much more than an inch or so tall. But look how much difference there is in the root mass between the tall and the medium, and the medium and the short, and then the short to the tall. My gosh. So there is a correlation. Those short mown grass plants, those plants that are consistently cut short, are going to have a reduced root system. They're not going to have as much mass in the root system. Therefore, they don't have the ability to store energy as well, because they don't have as much storage space. If that root system does not extend down deep enough, it cannot reach down and get any water that may be stored deeply in a deep soil, simply because the grass is being maintained too short. So that's I think a perfect example, the best, better than any words at all, to show you why it's important to not mow that grass shorter than it should be mowed. Again, when you're mowing, the idea is to remove no more than a third of the of the height of the grass, the length of the grass blade. And one reason, we've already talked about, because you stress the grass, you're cutting off sunlight receptor and forcing it to pull out stored energy, but also clippings are not bad unless you create so much clipping production out there that you're creating piles and clumps of clippings that are going to be thick enough to obscure sunlight. That if it can stop sunlight, that's no good, because the plant's not getting sunlight, it's not photosynthesizing, and also that area underneath those mats and piles of grass are going to stay damp longer, and you can have fungal pathogens that like to grow in there. Some insects would find that to be a good environment, a desirable environment. So if you're mowing and you're creating piles of clippings like that, you need to rake those up, put them in a compost pile. And sometimes it's hard, it rains, you can't mow for several days. It happens, okay, it happens. But when you do come back and mow that tall grass, you don't, if you've been mowing it 3 inches and that stuff standing 6 inches tall, you don't mow it off at 3 inches right then if you want to do what's best for the grass. You want to set the mower as high as you can and cut it, and then maybe come back the next day and drop it a little and cut it a little more and kind of work it back down, so that you don't shock it by cutting it off so much. Or if you do that every once in a while, it's not the end of the world. But if you consistently do that, I can assure you, you are going to shorten the lifespan of that population. You're going to thin that grass out, and you're going to have to do some renovation work sooner than you would have otherwise. It's also not a bad idea to change direction when you mow, so that you don't mow continuously in the same tracks all the time. And the idea is, if you consistently mow in the same track, same pattern, time after time, especially if the ground is damp when you mow, then you're just increasing compaction by following that same pattern over and over again. And if it's a sod forming grass, one that creeps and knits together, you can encourage it to grow in one direction by continually mowing in that direction, and develop something called grain in the grass. Maybe in a home lawn, it's not that big a deal, but for a sports field where ball roll or ball bounce, comes into play, or it has to be considered, grain affects ball roll. So especially on the golf course, that's kind of a big deal. The point of this slide here is to show that over the years, the appearance of people and the way we dress and the appearance of lawnmowers has changed. But the way lawnmowers cut grass has not changed. In this image on the left side, we see an old rotary cut mower. On the right side, we see an old reel mower. Okay. Well, today we have rotary mowers and we have reel mowers. And rotary mowers are those that cut with they have a blade or multiple blades attached to a mowing deck, and the cutting edge of the blade is out on either end of the blade or blades. Okay, the cutting ends are out on the ends of the cutting edges are on the ends of the blades. The blades that they turn, they spin around, and they cut. They cut with basically centrifugal force. There's nothing holding that grass blade up unless there's a little suction, a little lift created by the blade spinning underneath the mower deck. And they don't provide the cleanest possible cut out there, but they are the most efficient in terms of being able to cover ground, to mow large areas in a shorter period of time, especially with a ride-on mower, zero-turn mowers, most efficient way to cut grass out there in terms of speed. With these rotary mowers, whether the ride-on type or the walk-behind, the push type, you've typically got more range of adjustment to mow high or to mow low. Whereas a real mower, you don't have that same level of adjustment. A thing to keep in mind is that any of these mowers can be weapons of grass destruction if you consistently mow that grass way too short. Okay, when you're mowing it way too short. With the lawnmowers, we saw the stripes at the opening slides there. We talked about when we introduced mowing. There are striping kits that can be added on to either walk behind mowers or riding mowers if you want to put that, to have that striped appearance in your lawn. Okay, striping kits can help do that. Just mowing in alternating directions is going to create the stripe, but whether the rollers or whether the brushes will enhance that effect. Okay, will enhance that. The way rotary mower blades, I already mentioned that they're sharp on either end. That's where the cutting edge is. You got a mulching blade up here. It's got some curve in it. The idea is for a mulching blade, the way it works is you got some lift in there to keep the grass blade suspended inside the deck a little bit longer to give those spinning blades. And we're talking about blades that are spinning, maybe 4,000 or so revolutions per minute. So they're spinning around pretty fast to maybe chop those blades of grass a couple to 3 times before they land back on the ground again before they're discharged out. So they're cut up into smaller pieces. Then you've got the standard blades. They have a more flat design, and it's called a 2-in-1 blade. So it's a 2-in-1 because it's either for bagging or for discharging out the side or out the rear, however the thing discharges. The cutting edge is out here on the end of the blade, though. Okay, it's out here on the end, so that's the only sharp part of it. And again, it has to try to to cut that grass blade off. There's nothing holding that blade up, so you want to maintain sharp mower blades. The other option is to use a reel mower, R-E-E-L, reel mower. And you got 2 examples here. You got a human powered reel mower. This Fiskars up here on the top and on the lower right hand side, and you've got a motorized self-propelled reel mower down here on the lower left hand side. From what are the pros of a reel mower? Well, number one, they're the highest quality cut. They cut with a more scissors-like action. They don't cut anything like a rotary mower does. A reel mower has one cutting blade, one cutting knife. Okay, and they're called a reel mower because you can see the mouse pointer up here on this upper right-hand picture of this Fiskars push type. The reel, okay, is made up of these blades, but those are not really cutting blades. They don't have a sharp edge on them. The cutting edge, the cutting blade on this mower is down here underneath. It's at the bottom of the mower, and you can't really see it. It's called a bed knife. It's a stationary knife that doesn't move. But the way these reel mowers work, the way they cut is, as you push this thing forward, that cylinder turns and it pulls these blades of grass as they rotate forward backwards against that stationary bed knife down there, and it cuts the grass more like a pair of scissors. It clips the grass off. So it provides a cleaner cut. It's not a ragged edge cut because you're not relying on centrifugal force. So from a quality cut standpoint, the reel mower is the best quality out there. So what are the downsides? What are the cons of that? Well, as you can see, they're not very wide, so they don't cut a large area at one time. Some are human powered. Okay, if you're trying to cut tall grass with a human powered mower, it's much more work. Okay, now granted, some of these newer models like this Fiskars type here does have a wider range of height adjustment. Some of the old ones did not adjust very much, but this one lets you adjust up to almost 4 inches in height. So you do have that. Ability. But they don't do a good job of cutting junk. Okay, it's just harder to cut weeds and stuff than it is with a rotary mower. You can't run over limbs, little branches, twigs, and whatnot, because they can get lodged up in there and lock the reel up against the knife blade. So the reel mowers work better on good grass, good quality grass. But they provide an excellent cut. They can be the perfect mower for small lawns. You don't have to keep gasoline on hand, no oil on hand, little limited storage space for especially the push type mowers. If you're going to use a powered reel mower, it's just like any other power equipment. You've got to have the lubricant, you got to have the fuel on hand, etc., and so on. But those are the 2 options when it comes to lawnmowers. They can both do a good job, but blades need to be sharp. Okay, and you can see in this image how much damage a dull mower blade can cause, and this was caused by a rotary mower with a duller blade. How often do blades need to be sharpened? Well, I don't know how often, okay, because I don't know I don't know that every case is the same. But once a year is not enough. Should it be done once a day? Probably not. Is once a month enough? I don't know that it is. It might be, it might not be. It just depends on what you're running over. I mean, just mowing grass will dull the blade. Then if you hit other things, sticks and rocks and whatnot, then that dulls it even faster. So blades need to be sharpened, often enough to avoid having this kind of appearance on them. And when I see something like this, though, I got to ask the question: are you cutting the grass? Or are you beating it into submission? And I think in this case, maybe there's a little more beating going on there. It's cutting going on. Okay, that's enough on mowing. Now let's go to the second primary maintenance practice, fertilization. Okay, fertilization. There are a number, 18, 19 different essential nutrients that plants need, that turf plants need, and they're essential nutrients. Now, some are used in greater quantities than others. All right, and those that are used in the greatest quantity are called the primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then you've got the secondary nutrients: calcium, magnesium, sulfur, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They fall in there too. Then zinc, chlorine, boron, molybdenum, copper, iron, manganese, cobalt, nickel. They're called secondary and micro, not because they are any less important than the primary, but because they're used in a much smaller quantity. Plants don't need as much of them. They need them. They just don't need as much of them as they do these primary nutrients. So primary, they're used in the greatest quantity, secondary and the next level, and then micronutrients in the smallest quantity. So how do you know what you should apply in terms of fertilizer? Well, you don't know, okay, unless something tells you that, unless you evaluate, unless you measure the fertility. So a key to a good fertility program is to have a good soil test. And how do you get a good soil test? You have a good soil test by pulling a good soil sample. A good soil sample sent to a soil lab should result in a good soil test and accuracy. When I say good, it's an accurate test. Okay, it's an accurate test. And the test is no better than the sample you've seen. A sample needs to be representative of the area that you're going to manage as a unit. So for most home lawns, you want to go to multiple locations in the yard, 8, 10, 12 spots, and sample the top 6 inches of soil in each one of those places and put that over in a bucket, mix that together to create a composite of that entire lawn area. The only time you would not do that is if there is a marked difference between one area of the lawn and the other. There's just something way different about it. You might want to sample that different area separately from the rest of the lawn. But otherwise, assuming that it's fairly uniform, and most people's yards are going to be fairly uniform, then you want to take a composite sample from multiple locations mixed together to create that composite. About every talk that includes something about soil sampling and testing, it'll show using a soil tube or a little soil auger like this one that pulls the plugs to go out and sample with. Boy, those things are handy. They really are. But how many of you have a soil tube or an auger? And if I were in the room with you, and I would bet you there would be none to very few hands being raised, because who has those things? The extension agents might, but most people do not have one of those. And you don't have to have one of those to pull a good soil sample. You can do the same thing with a shovel. Most everybody's got a shovel. All right. So with a shovel, you're gonna do the same thing. You're gonna take a slice of soil, about a 6-inch deep sample, just like you see pictured here. But are you gonna put that whole shovel full of dirt, that soil, over in that bucket? Well, if you go to 10 or 12 places out in the yard and you're taking full shovelfuls and dumping in there, by the time you get through, that bucket's gonna be heavy, and you have pulled a lot of dirt out of the yard. So you don't have to do that. Instead, take an old knife and cut a center slice out of that shovel slice, like you see pictured here, and cut the grass debris off the top of it, and then take that slice out of the center, throw that over in the bucket, put the remaining soil and you shovel back in the hole again. Then you mix all that up in the bucket, and then you fill up your soil test box, okay, and you send that off to the soil lab. Now, this shows University of Tennessee soil submission sheet right here. Yes, UT, we have a soil testing lab in Nashville, and they'll be glad to test your soil for you. But we're not the only one out there. UT is not the only soil testing lab out there. There are private labs. Some co-ops will, if you take a soil sample to them, they'll send it to another lab. Here where I live, they'll for home lawns and whatnot, they typically send those to the UT soil lab. Or you can take the sample, you can send it yourself to the UT soil lab. Paperwork is there at the extension office. You can also download it, go online to the University of Tennessee Soil Plant Test Center under soil analysis, soil testing analysis, It's got the paperwork there. You can download those forms, print them off, fill them out. You can't download the box, obviously, but they have boxes at the extension office, but you don't necessarily have to put it in the box. You can seal it up in a Ziploc bag. You need about 1.5 cups of soil, okay, out of this mixture that you've created by going around to all these different places and creating that composite. You fill out the soil test report or the submission sheet with appropriate information, send that into the lab. And they're going to come back, just a very short period of time from the time it arrives at the lab with the report and also fertilization recommendations for your crop. And you're going to tell them what your intended crop is when you fill this submission sheet out. And we're talking about turf care. I'm not worried about gardens and flowers or anything else. We're talking about turf out here. So if you're filling out a soil test submission sheet for turf, you're going to choose the crop code. It's listed right on the front of it, either for warm season turf or for a cool season turf or both. You can choose both on the same sample. Okay, and it's going to come back and it'll have the results are going to be the same whether you chose one or the other, but then it'll have fertilization recommendations which will be different for a cool season turf grass versus warm season turf grass, especially the timing of when you would apply the fertilizer. But anyway, and if you got questions about that, Carla can certainly help you out there, or maybe some other folks at the extension office could answer a question about that. But so once we've got the soil sample collected, we get it sent off to the lab. You come back with a soil test report, and it tells you what they found. It tells you what soil pH is, what phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, manganese, boron, sodium levels are. And then those are printed across here. Okay, and then down here it starts making fertilization recommendations. And so the crop they chose that they listed, they're growing cool season turf. Their soil pH was 5.81. So that tells us it's a little bit acid. The pH range, the pH scale is a 14-point scale. 7 is right in the middle. So 7, a measure of 7 is neutral. It's neither acidic nor is it basic. Anything below 7 is acid, and the further away it gets from 7, the more acid it is. Anything above 7 is basic, and the further it gets away from 7 on the high side, the more basic it becomes. pH is kind of a big deal because there could be adequate quantities of these nutrients out here in the ground. But if the pH is not in the range it needs to be for the crop being grown, then those nutrients may not be available for uptake by the plant just because of soil chemistry and that pH keeps them locked up. And the plant cannot extract enough, it cannot pull enough of that nutrient out of the ground in order to meet its needs. And that's why pH is important. That's why it's a big deal. And this graph kind of shows you that. It shows us that here, okay, at a pH of 7 and slightly below, okay, so we're in that slightly acidic range, that these nutrients, and they're expressed by these horizontal bands, these horizontal green bands. Okay, the wider or the greater the width of that band, that indicates that the nutrient being named there is more available. As the band width narrows, that tells us that it becomes less available. So if we look at a pH of neutral to slightly acidic, okay, down here in the above 6 range, okay, between the 6.1 and 7 range, that most of those nutrients, they're all in they're available in enough quantity to meet the plant's needs. Whereas if we start becoming more acidic, they become less available, or some, as we become more basic, they become less available. And it's possible for some elements that if you go far enough in either direction, they can become so available they can become form a toxicity problem for the plant. So pH is kind of a big deal, okay, and that's the soil test tells you that. And as we look back here, it tells us what pH is. This one was acidic, so if it is acidic, that pH needs to be adjusted, needs to be raised. That's done by applying lime, and it tells us here that they're going to recommend that there be 100 pounds of limestone applied per 1,000 square feet of yard area. And then it says specific fertilization and liming rate and timing information is presented in notes that accompany this report. And that in the notes part, that's when it gives you suggested fertilization schedules of when you would think about applying fertilizers for cool season grasses, or when you would think about applying fertilizers for warm season grasses. Okay. Now, if your soil pH needs to be adjusted, it's down, okay, or excuse me, if it's too low, it needs to be adjusted up. If it's acid, lime is going to be your amendment to use. Here's an example of pelletized lime. You know, lime, it says pelletized dolomitic limestone. So it's got some calcium, it's got some magnesium in there, and it's pelletized. That means that those fine limestone particles have been glued together in pellets. Basically, you can have ground agricultural limestone or pulverized lime. It's the same, can be the very exact same stuff, except it's not pellet, it's in a powder form. It's much messier to apply. You would not want to apply a powdered limestone, a crushed limestone like that, in a broadcast spreader, because it's going to fly throwing dust everywhere. So the pelletized works better for broadcast spreaders. If you were ever to hit a case where the pH was too high and it needed to be made more acidic, the common recommendation is to use something like granular sulfur, just elemental sulfur, to lower that pH. When do we fertilize grasses? When they're growing. So for cool season grasses, you know, spring and fall, it's when they are the most growth is taking place. That's when they can best utilize the nutrient. There's no point of fertilizing a plant over here in the middle of the summer if it cannot utilize that, if it's not growing well enough to utilize the fertilizer. So that would be a waste of resource, and you're not doing the plant any good. So cool season grasses, fall and the spring. Warm season grasses, once they start growing in the spring, throughout the summer, as we transition into the latter part of the summer. We don't think about fertilizing warm season grasses past the early part of September. We probably don't think about fertilizing them before the beginning of or the middle of April each year. The amount of fertilizer applied per unit of area may be the same between warm and cool season grasses, but we're doing it at different times because we're trying to coincide with the growing period of the grasses. That's when they're going to have the greatest nutritional requirement. You know, you look at a bag of fertilizer, you probably looked at these before. I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, but they're always going to display these three numbers. And those three numbers always represent, in this order, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The first number is nitrogen, the second number is phosphorus, the third number is potassium. And they are percentages, okay, percentages. You know, this is a 40-pound bag. Boy, you know, math was never my greatest subject in school. So to make it easier, to put this in perspective, well, just think if you had 100 pounds of this fertilizer material, it's 24% nitrogen. That means that 24 pounds out of that 100 pounds are nitrogen. 4 pounds, it's 4% phosphorus. 4% of it is going to be phosphorus, or 4 pounds, and then 12% potash. Okay, so 12% is going to be the portion of potassium that's in that 100-pound bag. All right. So those numbers are always going to be listed in that order. And some of those numbers will be zeros. Okay. From a nitrogen standpoint, you know, there's two kinds of nitrogen. There's quick release, and then there's slow release nitrogen. This slide just shows you how rapidly some of these different nitrogen sources will release and how long it can last. Ammonium sulfate, you know, it's quick release, highly water soluble, and it may last, you know, 7 days to 2 weeks on the high side. Urea is another fairly highly water soluble product. It can start releasing very quickly under the right conditions. It may last up to 20 days, but then you put a coating on that urea, like a sulfur coating, and it may take it longer to start to release, and it may last for 12 months, okay, before it releases all. But these coatings are put on there to make them slow release. So then you have PCU, which is polymer coated. So a polymer coated and polymer coated plus sulfur coated urea, it may take them up to 3 days to begin to release, but they may release for months at a time. And then you come down to things like methylene urea. It may take a few days to start to feed. They can feed for 4 months or longer. And urea formaldehyde, that's another form of nitrogen, blue chip nitroform, or a couple of brand names, that they can feed for, you know, months at a time. Natural organics like mill organite, like Nature Safe is a brand. I'm not familiar with that brand. Sustain is a brand. Mill Organize is one that I am familiar with, and you'll see other organic fertilizers that are plant-based or animal manure-based. Those are the original slow release products because they've got to be broken down by soil microbes in order for those nutrients in there to become available, and they feed for a longer period of time because those are slow release products. Okay, so slow release products take longer for the results to start showing up, but they feed for a longer period of time. And they provide a more steady supply of nutrients versus everything being released all at once, and you get a spike of growth and it falls off. And you hit it with another water soluble source, and it's readily available, so you get another spike of growth and it falls off. This using the slow release products in combination with a little bit of the quick release make a more even growth appearance out there. And it's when you buy a bag, and typically it's this day and time, if you buy a bag of lawn fertilizer, you check the label, it'll say there's some percentage of it's highly or quick release, and then the rest of it's going to be slow release nitrogen, etc. Some fertilizers are called complete because they have all three of the primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Some fertilizers don't have all three. Here's one that's at 2904. It's an incomplete. Okay. It does not have any phosphorus in there. Why should you put phosphorus on ground on a yard if you have a high level of phosphorus already there? Or why should you put a high level of potassium on the lawn if you've got a high level of potassium already there? And the only way you know that is via soil testing. And soil tests can keep you from wasting nutrients, can keep you from over-fertilization. It's just a great idea, in my opinion, to be soil tested. You can find some fertilizer won't have any phosphorus or any potassium, or excuse me, any nitrogen or any phosphorus, maybe some potassium in there. And this one also has some crabgrass pre-emerging. The point is, they come different ways. They come packaged different ways. And you want to use the one that meets your needs. And the soil test report is going to tell you, kind of what will meet what you need. It'll steer you in the right direction. I would steer you away from this. If you ever see one that's labeled 000 for a fertilizer, I wouldn't buy it. Okay, it's probably not very much value in it. And this slide, it says most any fertilizer can be the right one if it's got the needed nutrients. And the point is, it teaches you how to calculate how many pounds of fertilizer it takes to give you the pounds of nutrient that you want. Okay, and I call this divide what you want by what you've got. What you want is the pounds of nutrient. So in a soil test report will tell you, X number of pounds of this or whatever, nitrogen per 1,000 feet or whatnot. So how much fertilizer does it take to supply that? And typically the recommendations are to apply no more than a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 feet of yard area. Well, okay, so any fertilizer that has nitrogen in it can be used to do that. You just got to figure out how much of that fertilizer needs to be applied in order to supply that pound. Okay, so it's very simple. It's to divide what you want by what you got. What you want is a pound. Okay, or how many pounds you're talking about, but in this case, we're talking nitrogen a pound. All right, you divide that by what you've got. That's the percentage of nutrient that's in the fertilizer you have. So here's an example. This is a 2503 fertilizer. If you wanted to put out a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 feet, okay, or a pound of nitrogen, how much of this fertilizer does it take to do it? Well, a pound is what you want. What you've got is a 25% nitrogen, so 1 pound divided by 0.25 tells you it's going to take 4 pounds of this 2503 fertilizer to supply 1 pound of nitrogen. And so every 4 pounds, so if for every 1,000 feet of yard, you apply 4 pounds of this 2503, you applied a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 feet and, just a little over 1/10 of a pound of potassium per 1,000 feet. So anyway, that was the whole point of that operation. When it comes to applying fertilizer, it's kind of like a spreading seed. The idea is to put the right amount out uniformly on the lawn. It can be done with a broadcast spreader or a drop spreader. Broadcast spreaders are more efficient. They cover a larger area. They can, you can cover more space in a shorter period of time. But again, you want to be uniform. You see dark stripes, light stripes, dark green, light green, dark green, light green. Somebody was not uniform. They did not spread that fertilizer evenly over that lawn area. With a drop spreader, it's hard to see your tracks in the grass, so a way to do that, and with a drop spreader, you've got to overlap tracks a little bit. okay, because this thing only drops fertilizer in between the wheels. So you got to overlap it. If you use a drop spreader, if that's what you want to use on your yard, that's fine. Do it when the dew is on the grass so you can see the tracks, okay? Otherwise, it's going to be hard to keep from striping it up like that. With a broadcast spreader, a way to help ensure, and it's, you know, you can certainly make mistakes with the broadcast spreader. You can minimize those if you will apply half your fertilizer going in one direction and then apply the other half going at a 90-degree angle to it. And that way you can mitigate any skips or someone you may have had in that first in the first go round. Just trying to ensure a uniform application. You know what? If fertilizer lands out here on a sidewalk or a driveway, I promise you there's no research anywhere that shows those hard surfaces benefit from a fertilizer application. So to keep that from washing down into drains and winding up in water somewhere and causing some problems, you want to take, you know, leaf blower and blow that back on the yard, rake it up or whatnot. It's too expensive, number one, to waste like that. And number two, you know, it can have a negative impact on folks downstream from us. So, you know, you want to do things the right way every time. And putting fertilizer out here on a hard surface and leaving is not the right way. Next up is irrigation. You know, turf grasses can use anywhere from 1/10 to 3/10 of an inch of water every day, depending on what the weather conditions are. 1/10 of an inch of water on 1,000 square feet in a week is, 7/10 of an inch. 3/10 of an inch per week is 2.1 inches per 1,000 feet. How much is an inch of water worth? You know, how much is that? How much is that? So an inch of water on 1,000 feet is about 620 gallons. So that's a fair amount of water. Okay. That's a fair amount of water that these plants need. And the inch of water per week is kind of a year-round average. You know, it's going to need more in the hot summertime because you got greater transpiration, you got greater evaporation, water loss due to heat, due to wind, etc. But, you know, kind of an inch of water per 1,000 square feet per week. I mentioned right at the very beginning that you needed 6 inches of dirt to grow grass as a minimum. Well, here's why. Here's a big reason why. The more soil depth you have, the deeper that soil is, like you've got an underground storage tank, okay? Because the deeper that soil profile is, the more water that soil can hold. The more water it can hold, the more it can store. And that stored water can then be used by plants in times when you don't have adequate rainfall during the period. The plants can still pull stored water, okay, assuming that you're managing them to encourage them to have a deep root zone. And not show signs of stress. And then if you do things to compact your soil by mowing in the same direction over and over when it's wet, then you take away pore spaces out of the soil, and the pore spaces means that's where the water is going to reside. So if you reduce the number of pore spaces, you reduce the water holding capacity of that soil. That's why deep soil is so important. That's why you see grass turn brown over rocks, okay, in dry conditions, much sooner than you'll see it turn brown due to lack of water out here in areas where you got good deep soil. So deep soil is important. You begin irrigation when you've got the first signs of stress, or okay, if you're not on a schedule, if you're just going to hand water, you begin at the first sign of stress. And the first sign of stress, you know, can be footprinting. When you walk through the grass in the morning to go to the mailbox, you come back out at lunch, you still see footprints. That tells you that that grass has lost a lot of moisture out of it. It's lost turgor pressure. It's not jumping. It's not popping back up in an upright position anymore. So it needs some water. It's starting to show drought stress. When you do use irrigation, okay, you want to make sure that the water goes on the grass area or the crop area. You don't want it running off. You don't want to apply it faster than the ground will soak it in, so that it runs off, you know, down the driveway. Just like the fertilizer, there's no research that shows that pavement benefits from the application of irrigation water, and that's just a waste. Okay, and if you are irrigating a site and water is running off the site onto the pavement or whatnot, then you're probably irrigating faster than the infiltration rate of the soil will take the water in. So you got to change that. All right, slow it down so that you don't have that condition. You know, when should you water? So that ideally, so that you're going to minimize water loss, but also so that you're going to minimize disease promoting conditions that favor disease development. So, in the morning early, to midday are kind of the better times in terms of minimizing water loss in the first case early in the day, and then minimizing promoting conditions to develop disease. Irrigation in the middle of the day, it's better than late afternoon. Okay, because we don't want the sun to go down on that sopping wet grass. Okay, it's just been irrigated, because that promotes conditions that favor disease development. Just some irrigation recommendations: when you water the root zone, wet the whole zone. So you don't want to just wet the surface. You want to water it deep enough so that you're moving that water down in that top 6 inches or so. So, the goal is, if the goal is to put out an inch of water a week, do that at a couple of irrigations, or maybe, put out a third of an inch 3 times a week, so that you've got an inch for the week. Irrigation from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. and maybe 10 a.m. to 1 a.m. If you don't have a rain sensor, put one in, because it doesn't make sense to have an irrigation system running when it's raining outside. And if you don't have some kind of a sensor installed, if it's just on a timer or on a schedule, then that can very easily happen. The whole question, the whole idea about not putting that water out there late in the day so the sun sets on it while it's still wet is this right here. Here's an example of Pythium fungus that's attacked this turfgrass. This picture was taken by Dr. Wyndham of the Soil Plant Pest Center. Grass that goes that is wet, with lots of free moisture on it, in the dark, under high humidity conditions, creates a good environment for those fungal pathogens to grow, to attack that grass, to get established and grow and spread. So that's why we like to water earlier in the day. Now, what do you do if irrigation is not an option and it turns off hot, it turns off dry, and that grass is suffering? Well, former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, I think, had the right idea. In a case like that, according to him, says sometimes you got to just hunker down and take it like a jackass in a hailstorm and weather it out, and then hopefully things will get better, and conditions will improve, and enough grass will survive so that you don't have to start all over again. So dethatching, we've done our primary practice. Now we're moving into secondary practices. Dethatching is a secondary practice or supplementary practice. Those aren't done nearly as often as are the primary practices. Dethatching is the removal of thatch, and thatch is an intermingled layer of dead and living. You can see it listed there. It's dead and living plant parts that have sloughed off. It can be roots, it can be parts of stems, etc. And it's caught up between the green tissue on the top of the ground and then the mineral portion of the soil below ground. And this bottom picture, I think, does a good job of showing it. You got the grass blades, and you got the crown of the plant, and you got the soil down here. But in between the grass and the soil, there's this, kind of intermediate layer. That's the thatch layer. And if you can measure a ½ inch or more of thatch, then that thatch needs to be removed. Well, why? What's wrong with thatch? What's wrong with that? Here's the deal. Thatch repels water. Okay, so if you get a heavy thatch layer down there, then that soil can become hydrophobic, making it repel water instead of absorbing water, allowing it to run off during an irrigation event or during a rainfall event. And some insects that like a high organic matter environment, the thatch is certainly organic matter, and it can create a better habitat for them. So it might favor some infestations by certain insects. So removal of thatch when needed is an important thing. Now, a thing to keep in mind is bunch grasses don't form thatch very much. Tall fescue, ryegrass, they don't create thatch much. It's the sod forming grasses, Kentucky bluegrass, zoysia grass, Bermuda grass are the ones that most frequently form thatch and form it much faster. How do you remove thatch? There are dethatching tools. Here's a hand-powered dethatching rake. Okay, there's what it looks like, and it works. It's just it's hard work. It's best suited for small areas, but it'll sure wear you out. There are vertical mowers, vertimowers they're called, that are designed for working on larger areas. They're basically kind of slit seeders without a seed box on. You got this set of blades attached vertically to this horizontal shaft. It cuts through, slices through this turf down here into the lower level and pulls that thatch material up on top of the ground. Then you're going to rake that up or vacuum it up and put it in the compost pile. You do this when the grass is going to be growing good so that it can recover, because it does damage the grass. Okay, it does damage it. So it needs to be done during good growing conditions. Aerification is the next supplementary practice. And when we talk about aerification, you know, a lot of folks say, well, plug aerate, spike aerate. I'm talking core aerification. Core aeration is the most aggressive form. It's the most effective form of aerification out there. Okay, it's called plug aerification or core aerification because it removes these plugs or cores of soil out of the ground. So every one of these plugs used to be in the ground. So everywhere there used to be a plug, now there's a hole in the ground. So why is aeration done? Well, the point of aeration is to relieve compaction. And what's the big deal about compaction? What we said about the water. You know, if you have compacted soil, you compressed your pore spaces in the soil together. The pore spaces where water and where air reside in the soil. So if you have fewer pore spaces, you don't have the air and roots need oxygen. They need air in there. That's where they're going to get that air out of the pore spaces, and that's where the water is going to be available for plants in those pore spaces. So if you've got compacted ground, it doesn't hold as much air, it doesn't hold as much water, so it does not favor plant growth as readily as does non-compacted soil. Core aerification is the best way we've come across here for homeowners to improve the or relieve compaction and improve the aeration, okay, by aerifying that soil by creating more openings in it. You know, you can draw pictures look like what you want to, and this picture here is to favor the benefits or show the benefits of aerification. So on the left side, you got the grass, you know, it's got little shallow roots, it's kind of weak, but you come in, you core aerify it, you punch these holes in the ground, and boom, you got a place for water to come in, you got a place for nutrients and fertilizer to enter the soil, and then after a few weeks, well, heck, you've got more root growth because that's the way they do the picture, right? Does it really happen that way in real life? Yes, it does. And you can see here in this soil profile, the aeration hole, and look at all that root growth taking place in there. And granted, that is a sand-based soil, but it can also happen on the mineral-based soil. Here's some native dirt, okay, kind of like what you might have growing out in your yard. All right, that old brown dirt, you know, just common stuff. But you can see these aeration holes with the black material in there, the dark colored material, all these roots growing in there. Well, what's that dark colored material? That is compost. This grass was was top dressed after it was aerated. Okay, aeration. Okay, again, like dethatching, physically damages the grass, so it needs to be done when you've got good growing conditions, so the grass can recover from. Okay, so core aerification, and you can rent dethatchers, you can rent core aerators from power equipment rental stores. Bring them home, use them, and take them back again. The next supplementary practice I'll mention is top dressing. And top dressing, and I'm talking about top dressing with organic material like compost, is really about the only way to add organic matter to an existing turf without tearing the ground up. So how does it work? Well, so you've got to have holes in the ground in order for that compost or that top dress material to get in the ground. So you core aerate the lawn, and then you spread the top dress material out. And here's this illustrates this series of 3 slides, shows folks doing it by hand. And you can certainly do it by hand. Okay. It's hard work, but you know what? Get the family involved. It's good fun, it's good exercise. But so they've aerated the yard, they've got the compost material, they take it and spread it out in little piles, and then you know they rake it in. Okay, the idea is you've got those aeration holes in the ground. And now you're going to spread that compost material out, back and forth, moving it back and forth to encourage it into those aeration channels so that you start getting that organic material into that native dirt. Now, are you going to change it overnight, make it, you know, take tight clay soil and make it a high organic matter soil? No, you're not going to do that overnight because you're not going to put a great amount of material out there. You know, at the most, you're talking about a 1/2 inch thick layer at a time. But it starts to make a difference. It starts to make a difference. And if you do, your aeration and your top dressing under the right season, for example, under plant at the time of during the planting season, say for tall fescue, you know, in that early fall time frame, well, shoot, you core aerate, you spread your grass seed out there, and then you spread your top dress over. That's a good way to cover new grass seed to help encourage germination. But there are machines that will help you do this, and I'll show you those in just a minute. But just to give you an idea of how much material it takes to top dress with compost, this table shows you that to cover 1,000 or a yard of compost, a cubic yard, a 1/4 inch deep layer will cover almost 1,300 feet. A 1/2 inch layer will cover half that, 645 feet. So to cover 1,000 square feet at a 1/4 inch, it takes 0.8 of a yard. To cover 1,000 square feet at a 1/2 inch, it takes 1.6 cubic yards. So you can see that it can turn into a lot of material out there. And if you're doing it by hand, that's a lot of work. I'm not going to kid you about that. But instead of doing an entire lawn, maybe there is an area that's a trouble spot for you. And you've determined, the grass just doesn't want to grow there for whatever reason. You've determined, you've driven a rod down in the ground to determine that you've got, soil depth, that you don't go down there 3 inches and hit a solid rock. You can go down 6 inches or better, and you don't hit an impermeable object. So it's not a question of it. It's just physically you can't grow grass there. It's not deep enough. But if it's just poor soil for whatever reason, top dressing a smaller area is sounds more appealing to me than top dressing 500 feet versus top dressing 15,000 square feet seems a lot more doable. I'd come near doing that on a 500 square foot section of turf than I would hand top dressing a 15,000 square foot section of turf. So that's a way to maybe improve trouble spots out there in the lawn area. There are tools, here's a mechanized top dresser used for small yards. People just don't use those here. I've never seen one used, on a home lawn in Middle Tennessee. But these top dressers are great. They take a lot of the work out of it. You come along with a drag mat, which can be made of flexible metal or other material, even a piece of chain link fence with 2x4 tied on either end and hooked behind your lawnmower. Makes a good drag. And once you spread this top dress material out here, to drag it across the area to help encourage that into those aeration holes. Well, if the drag's not too heavy, you can hand drag. Or if you got good stout young boys at home, they can drag it for you. That's great exercise, good team building, family building stuff. So there's top dressing. Now, let's talk a minute about renovation. We're going to wind this thing up. Okay, you've been with us a long time. Sometimes, no matter despite our best efforts, things happen. So here's a tall fescue yard in the middle of the summer, and it's a pretty good cover out there. But there's some places the grass has been thinned out. Maybe there was a little disease in there, maybe some heavy traffic right through this area. We don't know necessarily, but I'd say maybe a little brown patch disease may have thinned this out. But if an area, if a lawn has 50% or more of the ground covered with desirable plants, then typically all that's necessary to thicken that up is to overseed into it, to increase that population density. And this is generally what you do with turf or with bunch grasses like turf top, tall fescue, and so on. A good tool to use in a site like this is one of these slit seeders that we saw early in the talk. They've got the blades that cut the slits. Some have a seed box in front of the slits so that the seed drops on the ground and the knives are cutting the seed into the ground a little bit, if you will. Others have a seed box mounted back here behind the knife blades so that the slits are cut and the seed drops in the slits. Either way works pretty good. Okay, but this is a good way to improve an existing turf that you've got at least 50% of the ground covered in desirable plants. But another way is to core aerate. Okay, core aerification, you're punching lots of holes in the ground. Then you come along and you broadcast the grass seed over that aerated area. Those seed that fall in the aeration holes typically are the ones that have the best chance of germinating, but that's a good way. Okay, you're improving compaction, relieving compaction, and you're opening it up to get those seed in the ground to help improve germination. So you can do that in that late summertime, early fall time frame on cool season grasses to improve those thinned out areas where you've got 50% or better ground cover. What about if you wanted to overseed Bermuda grass into Bermuda grass? Well, again, you're going to do that in that May, June time frame. Okay, that's when that grass is planted from seed. But what if the lawn has less than 50% desirable plants? You got a lot of junk out there. It's hard to find grass. You got ground cover, but you don't like it, so you want to do away with it. If you've got less than 50% desirable plant cover, that's time for a total renovation. So here's this in pictures. Okay, I've talked long enough in pictures. This gentleman agreed to be a demonstrator for this little project. His yard was primarily crabgrass. So in late August, he treated that lawn with glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup or the non-selective materials, killed all of the crabgrass. In the early part of September, he went down to the rental store. He rented a dethatcher. Now, he removing thatch? Not really, but look what he is doing. He is cultivating, as you can see over here where the mailbox, okay, he started the street working up towards the house. You can see the difference in the color. That's where that dethatcher has been. That thing is cutting into the upper surface of the soil. It's cultivating that soil, okay? It's opening it up. So he's creating bare soil. In this case, he's using a dethatcher to do it. And he's making a place for that seed to contact bare soil. So he's got his tools over here. So after he dethatched, he raked some of that trash up. He didn't get near all of it up because it's going to act like straw out there that glyphosate killed crabgrass stubble. So he raked some of the excess up, put it in the compost pile. He spread his fertilizer out there. He used Kentucky 31 tall fescue. I mean, that's what he wanted to use. You know, it's your yard. You do what you want to do. So he spread the fertilizer, and then he spread the grass seed. He used the push type broadcast spreader for the fertilizer. Then he used his over the shoulder old-fashioned broadcast spreader for the grass seed. And you know what? It may be old-fashioned, but those old rotary spreaders like that are great for small seeded grasses. You can be very precise. You can walk right up where you want to put the grass, and they do a good job, good even application. Then after he finished seeding, he put his little sweep type hose in sprinkler out there. He's a retired fella. He sprinkled it 3 times a day. Sprinkled a little bit in the morning, a little bit around midday, a little bit in the evening. Okay. Now we're not trying to keep grass from getting sick here. We're trying to get grass germinated, right? So he's wetting it a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the middle of the day, a little bit in the evening, just enough to keep the upper grass surface damp or the upper soil surface damp so that those grass seeds don't dry out and they'll germinate quickly. You know, 6 weeks later, he's got a good dense stand of tall fescue in that yard, where before that, it was, probably 75, 80% crabgrass. Okay. Now, we've talked about the maintenance practices, primary and supplementary practices. Then that brings down to pest management. You know what, folks? Pest management, that's a talk in and unto itself. So I feel like I have spent a lot of time here with you this evening, and I'm going to bring things to a conclusion. As I close, I just want you to remember, there are worse things in the world than having to work on the lawn. For instance, being chased by an old rooster might be worse than having to work on the yard. So that being said, that's the end of this. I would ask you, do you have any questions? And I do notice there have been some questions pop up in the chat. Let me go up in there and take a look, see what we've got.
Yeah, I put the link to the UT Hort lawn care site. There's several publications on there that go through renovation, et cetera, et cetera. So
okay, all right. So Connie Mayo said, I was late returning from the break. After class, would you please address wild garlic and laripe again? I must have missed it. You did not miss it, because I did not address it in laripe at all. No. I'm assuming you're wanting a recommendation for control in laripe. I don't know offhand that there is a selective herbicide that will control wild garlic and not damage laripe. Of course, laripe is not a turf grass. It's not. So, I mean, that's kind of outside my realm here. But if I'm not mistaken, Carla, there is not a broadleaf herbicide that is labeled for over-the-top application of laripe. Are you aware?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd have to look it up.
I mean,
the weed manual and see
if it were grasses. You know, if you had some grasses in there, but wild garlic is not a grass. It's a grassy like plant. It's not a grass. But if it were grass, you could use some Ornament, you can use some Fusilade, you can use Post, but it's going to take something that's got some like 2,4-D dicamba mecaprop. And boy, I would have to read the label on that, but I'm not sure that you can apply that to your monkey grass. I'm not sure that there is a product that you can apply, a broadleaf product that you can apply to control garlic and not damage monkey grass. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you probably the answer you'd like to have on that one. Let's see, other questions. My kid had a little bag of urea that came with a science kit last Christmas. Now I know what to do. Now I know what it is. Okay, very good. Urea is a nitrogen source. Yes, it is. That's what it is. Steve and Lorraine said, inherited a lawn when I bought my home. How do I get control of my lawn? Is overseeing an option? And how does that work? And when should it be done? Well, again, if you're talking about overseeding with cool season grasses, you should have been doing that this afternoon. Time's running out for this year.
Time's running out. Yeah.
For cool season grass overseeding is the primary window is September, October. The next best option is early spring, March, first part of April. But even, knowing that those spring planted cool season grasses are not going to be as strong during the summer as a fall planted cool season grass is. If you want to overseed, if you want Bermuda grass or a warm season yard, then you're going to wait until March would be the earliest as you think about trying to plant any warm season grass seed in that lawn. This would be a case. I think we probably need to talk a little more one-on-one to see exactly what your situation is. I mean, it may be one of those cases where you just need to kill it all and start over. I don't know what's out there now, but there are certainly cases where that is the best option. If you don't have enough desirable grass, then there's no, then you just kill what's there and start with a clean slate. So here's where Carla put the uthort.com link and the section for home turf grass management. Question here from Lori. She says, can I use a broad fork to aerate before top dressing? Yes. I mean, anything that'll punch a hole in the ground, anything that'll punch a hole in the ground and leave a hole in the ground can be used to open up aeration channels and then create a space that you can work your top dress material in. I would say I'd say there is a little advantage to core aerification versus a broad fork. And this, it's not enough to not do this, okay? But I just want to point this out. When you use a core aerator, it pulls that plug out of the ground. So you created a space, okay, by removing something. If you use a fork, you created that space by pushing stuff around the hole tighter together, right? So you didn't remove anything. So from a strictly from a compaction relieving standpoint, a core aerator probably does a better job than say a solid tine device like the broad fork. But I don't know that it's enough to not use a broad fork. By all means, if you use the broad fork and aerate, yes, you can certainly do that. You can certainly do that. And I don't want to nitpick. Okay, I don't want to give the impression that you shouldn't do that. Okay, am I missing anything? Other questions?
No, looks like you've covered them all. I've got one, and this was a home visit that I went on a couple weeks back. Crayfish mounds.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was in the driest part of their lawn because they had an area, like their front yard would, had the little piles, and it was really dry, compacted soil. We walked to the back and it was wet and we didn't see as many. And I don't know.
So are you, so what's your question?
I'm asking, do you know any good controls, or what would you recommend in that situation?
Well, so, I mean, there's not anything labeled you're going to apply because the concern is why are those crawfish there? Well, there's water somewhere. Okay? Yeah. And we don't want to put stuff in the water. Now, I'm wondering, is it wet enough they needed to they need to give it a little more dry ground, you know, and I've heard of them moving laterally away from a stream, you know, to get a little more dry ground before they start building.
Yeah.
But I do wonder though, if those were fresh mounds, or had they been made during the wetter part of the year, and I mean, you're just seeing them out there when it's dry. Now.
Yeah, she said they'd been there off and on all summer.
Okay, awesome. Okay,
They were,
I'm betting that it was that you saw a lot more, or that there's going to be more activity there during the winter period. I mean, crawfish not going to be out there when it's super dry. So, but as far as getting rid of the mounds, okay, well, no, not getting rid of. That's not the question. How can you discourage crawfish? Well, one way to do that. Now, this is going to tear the yard. This is going to tear the yard up. But to use a device, you know, like an old-fashioned subsoil, and to you know, rip some channels in that to see if you cannot modify that internal drainage enough to create an environment less favorable for those crawfish to come up in there. But improving the drainage. Now, you know, there are a ton of pesticides that will kill crawfish, but you don't know where they're going to go.
Yeah, that's true. They had applied. Yeah, this was the other bad part. He said they had applied some type of spectricide poison to kill lawn insects, and it just made me cringe.
Yeah.
Like, how many times? No, stop.
Trying to get rid of the crawfish.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean, that, you know, that's a jailable offense according to the pesticide place. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's off-label use. That's a violation.
It sure is.
No, alternate environment. I mean, that's the surest way. And just something. I mean, it could be simple. Heck, and you know, who's got odds are you're not going to find anybody in the lawn care business that's got one of those old-fashioned subsoilers.
Yeah, that's true.
But they could about do the same thing with a trencher, I think. I think.
Yeah. I told them. Well, I told them to start out with some core aeration and soil test, and
now, you know,
plant seed because their lawn was real thin.
If there was someone that, now there are some really deep tine aerators out there, but now they're commonly used on fields and on courses, not on yards. But I'm talking, you know, like 12, 14-inch tines on. That might make that, you know, you go down 14 inches, you may can change that environment enough to improve that drainage and change things up a little bit. But I mean, you're not going to go down to the rental store and rent one of those. You're going to be hiring somebody to do that.
Yeah. Yep. It's not going to be an easy fix for them.
No,
that's for sure. Not. So I'm just curious about your opinion on that. So
well, boy, there you go. That's worth, my opinion is worth a lot, I'm sure.
It is. It is. We appreciate it.
It's one of those things. There's not a good answer for it.
Yeah.
There's not an easy answer. But the simple answer is habitat modification. Well, true. Some nice comments, some very kind comments from people. I appreciate that. I'm reading.
Yeah.
Amanda from Glory. It's very kind of you to say that. Thank you. You hung a long time, and I hope nobody fell asleep and hurt themselves by falling out of a chair. It's fine to fell asleep, just don't hurt yourself. So how far along in the course are you all?
Oh, what do we got? About 4 weeks. 4 weeks
to go. Okay.
Something like that.
All right.
Without having a calendar in front of me.
Good luck.
Yeah, we're moving right along this year. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and close the meeting. Thanks again, Mitchell. I really appreciate it. And
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks everybody for showing up. We've got 34 people.
Hey, so you take care and keep on getting better, okay?
All right, I will. Working on it. Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.